At 043G, the desert exploded. Muzzle flash lit the canyon ridge in stuttering orange bursts, and soldiers scattered behind whatever cover they could find. Rocks, overturned supply crates, each other. In the chaos, one figure didn't flinch. Nurse Lena Voss dropped to a knee, raised a rifle nobody knew she was carrying, and put a round through a target 200 yards away in near total darkness. Then she pressed the radio to her lips and spoke 2 words so quietly that only the soldier beside her heard them. Iron Wraith. The channel went silent. Then a voice on the other end said, "Say again your call sign." And when she repeated it, Captain Derek Mallory, the man who had spent 3 weeks calling her a liability, turned and looked at her like he was seeing someone else entirely. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe right now and follow along until the very end. Drop a like if you're with me, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The assignment came through on a Thursday, which was the kind of mundane detail Lena Voss would later remember because everything after it stopped being mundane very quickly. Her orders were simple on paper. Temporary attachment to Redstone Forward Medical Unit at Fort Calder, supporting a joint Army exercise scheduled across 3 days in the Halverson Desert Corridor. She was listed as a trauma nurse, Level 2 certification, no combat deployments on her active record. The personnel clerk who processed her paperwork had looked up from the desk and asked, almost apologetically, whether she had ever been in the field before. Lena said yes. The clerk had nodded the way people nod when they don't believe you but don't want to argue about it. Fort Calder sat at the eastern edge of the Halverson Basin, where the desert stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was: flat, brown, punishing, and indifferent to the people who moved across it. The base itself was a collection of prefabricated structures and vehicle depots connected by gravel roads that turned to powder in the dry season. Lena drove through the front gate at 1100 and sat in her truck for a moment before getting out, watching the soldiers move between buildings with the particular efficiency of people who had stopped noticing their surroundings a long time ago. She grabbed her kit bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the medical unit. Captain Derek Mallory was standing outside the surgical tent when she arrived, talking to 2 of his staff with his arms crossed and his back to her. He was built the way officers who had spent their careers behind briefing tables sometimes got built, broad in the shoulders but soft around the jaw, carrying the posture of a man who had given enough orders that he had started to believe his posture was the same thing as authority. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. "Boss?" he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't match what they were expecting. Lena was 37, which might have been part of it. She was medium height, not particularly imposing, with the kind of face that read as unremarkable until you looked long enough to notice that the eyes were paying attention to too many things at once. She was wearing standard-issue nurse's scrubs over her base layer, her kit bag over one shoulder, her hair pulled back without ceremony. "You're with 4th Platoon support," Mallory said, turning back to his team as though the matter were settled. "You'll be carrying the secondary trauma kit during the field exercise. Stay behind the formation line. If we take casualties, you establish a holding position and wait for my people to bring them to you." "Understood," Lena said. "What's the threat assessment for the corridor?" Mallory glanced back at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not hostility yet, just the mild irritation of someone who had been interrupted by a question they considered irrelevant. "It's an exercise," he said. "The threat assessment is that there isn't one." Lena nodded and didn't say anything else. She spent the rest of that afternoon learning the layout of the medical unit, meeting the other nurses and medics, and quietly observing the rest of the platoon. The unit was attached to a rescue extraction team from 3rd Battalion, 22 soldiers assigned to simulate the recovery of a downed reconnaissance element in a canyon 3 miles south of the base. The scenario was designed to test evacuation protocols under pressure. The canyon route was narrow, exposed, and Lena noticed when she pulled up the terrain map on the briefing tablet someone had left on the supply table, bordered on the eastern ridge by a series of rock formations with excellent sightlines down into the canyon floor. She made a note of it and said nothing to Mallory. That night she ate alone in the mess, which was not unusual for her. Across the room, a cluster of the platoon's NCOs were talking loudly about the exercise, debating the best route through the canyon. She listened to their conversation without appearing to listen. The name that came up most often was Sergeant First Class Tobias Grund, a stocky, loud-voiced man with a reputation, according to the medic who had introduced himself as Kowalski, for knowing the Halverson terrain better than anyone else in the battalion. He mapped those canyons during a training rotation 4 years ago, Kowalski said. He was sitting across from Lena now, having decided, apparently, that she was less threatening than the other NCOs. Knows every switchback. Does he know the Eastern Ridge? Lena asked. Kowalski blinked. The ridge above the extraction point? There's a rock formation, northwest face, about 600 meters above the canyon floor. It's a natural observation platform. If someone wanted to watch the canyon without being seen from below, that's where they'd position. Kowalski looked at her for a moment. It's an exercise, he said, which was the same thing Mallory had said, delivered with considerably less condescension. I know, Lena said, just thinking out loud. She finished her meal and went to bed. The exercise launched at 0600 the following morning with the kind of controlled chaos that military training was designed to produce. 2 vehicles moved south from Fort Calder toward the canyon trailhead, while the platoon staged at the base of the approach route. Mallory gave his briefing in the flat, clipped language of a man who had given the same briefing many times. Maintain formation, suppress the simulated opposition force when contact was made, establish a perimeter around the simulated casualties, and hold until extraction. Lena stood at the back of the group and listened. When the briefing was done, Mallory walked toward her. You're carrying the secondary kit, he said. That means you're behind Sergeant Grun's element when we move into the canyon. How far behind? Far enough that you're not in the way. She held his gaze for a second. And if I identify a medical emergency before casualties reach the holding position? Then you wait for Grun to authorize movement. You don't break formation without my direct order. Lena said, Understood. Mallory held her gaze for another moment, as if he was trying to decide whether she was being insubordinate or merely asking reasonable questions. Apparently he settled on neither, because he turned and walked away without saying anything else. She shouldered the trauma kit. It weighed 42 pounds, she had checked, and fell into position behind the rear of the formation. They moved into the canyon at 0715. The Halverson Canyon system was striking in the way that hostile terrain sometimes was, genuinely beautiful in a way that felt vaguely threatening, the rock walls striped in rust and ochre, the floor covered in loose shale that shifted underfoot and announced every step with a faint grinding sound. The canyon narrowed as it ran south, and by the time the formation was a mile in, the walls on either side were close enough that Lena could see individual ledges and crevices clearly when she looked up. She kept looking up. The simulated opposition force, soldiers from a separate unit playing aggressor, was positioned around the first bend, which Mallory had been briefed on. They made contact at 0748, a controlled exchange of blank fire and evaluation flags, and the platoon responded according to plan. It looked good. It felt efficient. Lena watched from her position at the rear of the formation and kept looking at the ridge. At 0812, she saw movement on the eastern edge. It was subtle, a shape that didn't match the rock, shifting position behind a boulder 40 meters from the canyon rim. She watched it for 30 seconds. The shape moved again, and then a second shape appeared 10 meters to its left. These were not the aggressor soldiers. The aggressor soldiers were positioned ahead of the platoon, engaged in the planned exercise. Whatever was on that ridge had not been in the briefing. Lena pressed forward through the formation, moving past 3 soldiers who turned to look at her with the particular expression of people who have been told someone is supposed to stay behind them. She reached Grund. Sergeant, she said quietly, ridge, east side, 600 meters, 2 individuals moving south. Grund turned and squinted toward the ridge. I don't see anything. Second boulder cluster from the north end. They'll be behind cover now, but they moved twice in the last minute. Miss, Grund started. Voss. And I'm not asking you to act on it. I'm asking you to tell Captain Mallory. Grund looked at her for another moment, then pulled his radio. He spoke quietly, and 30 seconds later Mallory was moving back through the formation toward them, his face already carrying the expression of a man who had been interrupted by something inconvenient. What's the issue? He said, looking at Grund. Nurse Voss thinks she spotted something on the east ridge. Mallory looked at her. During a training exercise. 2 individuals, sir, moving south along the rim. They were not stationary, which means they weren't observing wildlife or sightseeing. They were tracking the formation's movement. "This is a training corridor," Mallory said. "Civilians don't hike it. The aggressor team is ahead of us. What you saw was probably a reflection or a bird." "It wasn't a bird." The word hung in the air between them. Lena could feel the attention of the nearby soldiers. Grund, two privates, a corporal named Witten, who had been watching the exchange from 2 meters away. Mallory lowered his voice. "I don't know what your experience level is, Nurse Voss, but this is not the place for you to be adding complications to a coordinated exercise. You're here to provide medical support. That is all I need from you. Get back to your position." Lena looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, sir," she said. She walked back to her position at the rear of the formation. She did not stop watching the ridge. At 0904, the first explosion happened. It came from ahead of the formation, not a training charge, not a blank round, but something that sent a concussive wave back through the canyon and lifted loose shale off the floor in a brief, violent spray. The sound was different from anything the exercise had produced, and the soldiers felt it before they understood it. The physical impact of displaced air hitting them in the chest like a closed fist. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then Mallory was shouting, and the formation dissolved into controlled scramble, soldiers dropping to cover behind rock formations and boulders, while the radio crackled with voices Lena couldn't fully parse from the rear. She pressed herself against the canyon wall, the trauma kit on her back, and did something that Mallory would later describe to the investigating officer as inexplicable and reckless, and that she would describe, much more simply, as looking at the situation the way she had been trained to look at situations. The explosion had come from ahead, but the ridge movement she had seen earlier had been tracking them from the east, moving south. If the intent was to collapse the formation between 2 points of pressure, the second element would be positioned to hit the evacuation route, which ran back north, the direction they had come from. She turned and looked north. 3 figures had dropped off the ridgeline and were moving down a dry wash that cut diagonally across the canyon floor, heading directly toward the 2 vehicles parked at the trailhead. "Hostile element north," she said into her radio. Nobody answered. The channel was chaotic with Mallory's voice and what sounded like Grund trying to account for personnel. "I have a visual on 3 individuals descending the North Wash, moving toward the evacuation vehicles. Someone respond." Mallory's voice cut through. "Who is this?" "Voss. North Wash, 3 individuals moving fast. They're 2 minutes from the vehicles." "I told you to stay off the command channel." A second explosion, smaller than the first, came from the direction of the vehicles. The radio went quiet for a full 3 seconds. Then Mallory said, "Grund, take 2 and check the north approach." Lena was already moving. She had been moving for 45 seconds, which was why she reached Corporal Witten, who had been separated from the main element and was crouched behind a boulder with a laceration across his forearm, bleeding through his sleeve, before anyone else did. She pulled the trauma kit off her back, had the wound packed and dressed in under 2 minutes, and was back on her feet before Witten had time to say more than, "Thank you." "Stay down," she told him. "Don't move until Grund comes back through." She moved forward along the canyon wall. What she found when she reached the forward position was a situation that had gone significantly wrong. The simulated aggressor element ahead had been neutralized according to plan, but 2 of the soldiers who had engaged them were down. One with what appeared to be a genuine ankle fracture from a fall on the shale, the other with a head wound that was bleeding more than it should have been. The head wound was not from the exercise. It was from a thrown rock, which meant that whoever had been on that ridge had come down into the canyon faster than she had tracked them. She went to the head wound first. The soldier's name was Kessler, a young private who was semi-conscious and confused about where he was. Lena checked his pupils, checked his airway, got a pressure bandage onto the wound, and started talking to him in the flat, specific way she had learned produced better outcomes than comfort language. Names, simple questions, concrete anchors. "Kessler, look at me. How many fingers?" 2, he said. "Good. Stay with me." She was still working on Kessler when Mallory arrived at the forward position and stopped when he saw her. "I told you to hold position," he said. "Private Kessler has a head wound, possible concussion. Private Danner has a fractured ankle. They need to be evacuated." She did not stop working while she spoke. "The north approach is compromised. You need another route." "I give the orders here." "Yes, sir, you do. And you should give the order to move these soldiers now, because if Kessler loses consciousness before we get him out, the field conditions make stabilization significantly harder." Mallory stared at her. Around them, soldiers were watching. Grund's element had returned, minus two who were still dealing with the situation at the vehicles. The canyon had gone quiet in the specific way that environments go quiet after violence, which was different from ordinary silence in ways that the human body registered before the conscious mind did. Mallory looked at Kessler. He looked at Danner, who was pale and sweating against a boulder with his ankle at the wrong angle. He looked back at Lena. "What route?" he said. It was not an acknowledgement of anything. It was a man who had run out of better options. "West Wall. There's a cleft about 300 meters back that opens onto the upper plateau, wider than it looks from the canyon floor. We can get a vehicle up to the plateau rim from the south access road." She had seen it on the terrain map, the same briefing tablet she had studied while everyone else was eating dinner. Mallory stared at her for another 3 seconds. Then he turned to Grund. "West Cleft. Move the casualties now." What happened over the next 40 minutes was not smooth. Danner's ankle made the climb difficult, and they improvised a drag litter from 2 rifle slings and a section of cargo net that someone found in a supply bag. Kessler deteriorated slightly midway through the ascent, became more confused, reached for things that weren't there, and Lena stayed on his left side the entire climb, monitoring his condition every 2 minutes and adjusting the bandage when it slipped. One of the soldiers, a private named Reese, slipped on the loose rock and landed hard on his knee. He kept moving, limping, and didn't say anything, which was either courage or stubbornness. And at that moment, the distinction didn't matter. They reached the plateau at 10:19. The vehicles arrived 40 minutes later, having navigated the south access road with difficulty. Kessler was loaded first, then Danner, then Reese. Mallory stood at the plateau edge and spoke quietly into his radio for several minutes. Lena sat on a rock and inventoried what was left in the trauma kit. Grund walked over and crouched beside her. He was in his late 30s, with a weathered face and the particular calm of someone who had seen enough difficult situations that a new one didn't automatically change his expression. "How did you know about the West Cleft?" he said. "Terrain map." "Mallory said you'd never been to Halverson before." "I hadn't. Maps exist." Grund was quiet for a moment. "Where did you do your nurse training?" Lena looked up at him. "Military nursing program, Walter Keyes Medical Center." "And before that?" She held his gaze. "Before that was before that." Grund looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who pushed. She had noticed that. He had a different quality than Mallory, which was patience. Not necessarily more intelligence, just patience, and the willingness to wait for the shape of a thing to become clear instead of forcing it. "Okay," he said, and stood up. He walked back toward the vehicles, and Lena went back to the inventory, and neither of them said anything else about it. The exercise was formally suspended at 1100 when the battalion operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Farah Osteen, arrived at the plateau in a command vehicle and spent 20 minutes with Mallory going over what had happened. Lena watched the conversation from a distance. Mallory gestured frequently. Osteen did not. The exercise suspension was announced over the Platoon channel without explanation, and the unit was ordered to stand down and return to Fort Calder. On the drive back, Lena sat in the rear of the second vehicle between Witten and Reese. Reese had his injured leg elevated on a supply case and was trying not to show that it hurt. Witten was quiet, watching the desert go by through the window. After a while, Witten said, without turning his head, "How far were those 3 guys on the North Wash when you spotted them?" "About 300 meters. "In that light?" "The sun was up." Witten was quiet again. Then he said, "Mallory's going to say the exercise was compromised by outside elements." "That's probably accurate." "He's also going to say you complicated his command structure." Lena looked at her hands. "That's probably also accurate." Witten turned to look at her for the first time since she had dressed his arm. He had a direct way of looking at people that was different from nosiness. It was the look of someone who was trying to determine whether something was true. "You're not actually a nurse, are you?" he said. Lena looked at him without expression. "I am a nurse," she said. "It says so on my orders." Witten held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the window. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. The debrief at Fort Calder was tense in the specific way that debriefs are tense when something went wrong that nobody has clearly articulated yet. Mallory ran the session, which meant he had the advantage of framing the sequence of events before anyone else could. He described the exercise as having been compromised by the unauthorized presence of civilians in the training corridor, a determination that was technically possible but that Osteen, sitting at the back of the room with her arms folded, did not appear to accept at face value. When Mallory mentioned that the medical support element had deviated from assigned position during the incident, Lena did not object or clarify. She sat in her chair and took notes on a small pad she kept in her breast pocket, which was something she had always done, and which several people in the room found, for reasons they could not quite name, slightly unnerving. After the formal portion of the debrief concluded and the platoon was dismissed, Osteen stopped Mallory at the door. The conversation was not audible to anyone else in the room, but it lasted 6 minutes by Lena's count, and when Mallory came back into the room to collect his materials from the briefing table, his face had a flattened, careful quality that it hadn't had before. He walked past Lena without looking at her. She finished her notes and left. Grund found her an hour later, in the supply bay where she was restocking the trauma kit. He came in without knocking, which was not unusual for supply bays. Nobody knocked in supply bays, and leaned against the shelving unit across from her workbench. "Osteen pulled your file," he said. Lena kept counting gauze packs. "Okay." She couldn't read most of it. Lena looked up. "Classified," Grund said. "Large portions of it. I've seen classified files before. Most nurses don't have them." Lena set down the gauze. She looked at Grund for a moment in the particular way she looked at things when she was deciding how much to say, which was a calculation she had been making for a long time and that she had become very good at. "No," she said. "Most nurses don't." Grund let that sit in the air for a moment. He was not going to push, and they both knew it, but he was also not going to pretend he hadn't said what he said. "Mallory's planning to file a conduct report," he said. "Unauthorized deviation from assigned position, interference with command decisions during an active operation. Even though the operation resulted in 3 casualties that received effective treatment? Especially because of that, I think." Lena was quiet for a moment. She picked up the gauze pack again and placed it in the kit. "He's not wrong that I deviated from assigned position," she said. "That's a factual statement." "It is," Grund agreed, "and the conduct report is within his authority to file." "Also true." "So." Grund stood up from the shelving unit. "So I thought you should know," he said, "because knowing things tends to be useful." He moved toward the door and stopped. "One more thing. Osteen's calling in additional assets for tomorrow's session. She's suspending the exercise for tonight, but she thinks whatever happened in that canyon wasn't civilian hikers. She's putting in a request for a second platoon and an intelligence element." Lena looked at him. "Did she say why?" "She said the movement pattern was tactical." Lena was quiet. Grund watched her face. It didn't change, not obviously, but something in it shifted the way something shifts when a person who already knew something hears it confirmed. "You knew," he said. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way he said most things, which was carefully and without drama. "I suspected," Lena said. "The 3 on the North Wash, they weren't civilians." "No," she said. "They weren't moving like civilians." Grund put his hand on the doorframe. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be different." He left. Lena stood at the workbench for a long moment after he was gone. She finished stocking the trauma kit with the methodical efficiency that she brought to everything. She checked the pressure bandages. She checked the hemostatic gauze. She checked the airway kit, the splints, the tourniquet pouches. She zipped the kit and set it on the floor beside her cot. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the darkness of the supply bay. She had been assigned to sleep in a partitioned section at the back, which was not unusual for temporary attachments, just another small signal that she was not really considered part of the unit. And she thought about the ridge. She thought about the movement pattern, which had been coordinated. She thought about the second explosion, which had been designed to close the north route before the first explosion fully registered. She thought about the timing of it, which had been precise. And she thought about the fact that whoever had planned the movement in that canyon had known the platoon's route before the platoon entered it. That last thought was the one that kept her awake. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket. In the glow of the tiny flashlight she clipped to the cover, she wrote 4 words in the shorthand she had developed years ago and that no one else could read. Then she clicked off the light. Outside, the desert was completely silent. No wind, no insects. Just the distant sound of a generator somewhere at the edge of the base, running low and steady, the way things run when they're working correctly and no one is watching. Lena stared at the ceiling and thought about the ridge. At 0340, she knew the time because she had not been asleep. She heard a sound that did not belong. It was not the generator. It was not the base's normal night traffic. It was a footstep on gravel outside the supply bay, moving slowly and with the particular rhythm of someone who was trying not to be heard, which meant they were not one of the unit's own sentries, because sentries did not move slowly. They moved routinely, predictably, in patterns that your brain learned to register as background noise. This was not background noise. Lena was off the cot and on her feet in 3 seconds. She pulled the rifle from under the edge of the cot, her own, signed out and logged, which was her right as a soldier, regardless of her assignment, and moved to the edge of the partition. She listened. The footstep again. Then a second one. Then a pause that lasted long enough for her to count to 7 before it moved again. She pressed herself against the wall beside the bay door and did not breathe. The door handle moved. The handle turned 3 centimeters and stopped. Lena did not move. She kept her back flat against the wall beside the door frame, rifle at low ready, and counted the seconds by the pressure of her own pulse. 1, 2, 3. The handle reversed, slowly, carefully, and she heard the footsteps again, retreating now, back across the gravel in the same deliberate rhythm they had arrived in. She waited 30 seconds before she moved to the window. The figure was already at the edge of the supply bay's shadow line, crossing toward the vehicle depot. Male, medium build, wearing dark clothing that was not a Fort Calder uniform. He moved with the low center of gravity efficiency of someone trained to move at night, and he did not look back, which told her he had decided the supply bay was occupied and had chosen to disengage rather than push through. That was a professional decision, not a civilian one. She watched until he was gone, then stood in the dark for 2 minutes, thinking. Then she pulled on her jacket, slung the rifle, and walked across the base to the operations building. The duty officer was a young lieutenant named Ferris, who looked like he had been asleep 20 minutes ago and was still deciding whether to be annoyed about it. Lena told him, without elaboration, that she had observed an unidentified individual moving through the supply area at 0340, and that the individual had attempted to access the supply bay before withdrawing toward the vehicle depot. She gave Ferris a physical description. She told him the direction of travel. She did not tell him how long she had been watching before she came to him, because that was a detail that would prompt questions she didn't want to answer at 0345 in the morning. Ferris called it in. Lena went back to the supply bay and did not sleep. By 0600, the base had the particular electric quality of a place where something had happened overnight, and most people didn't fully know what yet. The vehicle depot reported that one of the communications trucks had been accessed. A panel on the equipment rack pried open, the interior disturbed. Nothing was missing, but a small device had been attached to the relay housing, and the tech specialist who found it was very careful about the way he handled it while he waited for the ordnance team. It was not a bomb. It was a listening device. Lena heard this from Grund at 0630, outside the mess building. He told her in the same matter-of-fact voice he used for most things, which was either because he was genuinely calm or because he had long since decided that panic was not useful, and she suspected it was both. Signals intelligence, she said. That's what Austin thinks. Someone wanted to hear what we were sending on the exercise channel. Which means they were planning around the exercise, not just reacting to it. Grund looked at her. The duty log shows you reported a contact at 0344. I saw someone near the supply bay. Ferris said you were very specific about the movement pattern. I was awake, and I looked out the window. Grund held her gaze for a moment in the way he had, which was patient and direct and not particularly fooled. Mallory's going to hear about this, he said. He's not going to like that you were the one who flagged it. I know. He's already filed the conduct report. I know that too. Grund was quiet for a moment. Around them, the base was waking up. Vehicles moving, voices across the gravel, the smell of diesel and dry air that was Fort Calder's particular signature. Austin's assets are arriving this morning, he said. The intelligence element. And a second platoon from 2nd Battalion. Good, Lena said. She also requested a counterintelligence team from the regional command. They're looking at the possibility that the exercise route was leaked. Lena looked at her coffee. It was not good coffee. It was the kind of coffee that existed to be hot and caffeinated, two qualities it achieved reliably and nothing else. The movement in the canyon was too coordinated for opportunism, she said. Someone gave them the route and the timing. That's a significant accusation. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm describing a movement pattern. Grund almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the kind of expression that appears briefly on someone's face when they recognize something, before they decide whether to acknowledge recognizing it. Then it was gone. Eat something, he said. It's going to be a long day. The intelligence element arrived at 0845 in two unmarked vehicles, 4 people, civilian clothes, the kind of practiced ordinariness that was itself a form of uniform. Lena watched them from across the yard as they met with Osteen and the operations officer. She watched the way they moved and the way they listened and the way one of them, a woman in her mid-40s with her hair cut short and the posture of someone who had spent years being underestimated by rooms she walked into, stood slightly apart from the group and watched the base layout with the same quality of attention that Lena recognized because she had it herself. The woman's name, Lena would learn by midday, was Specialist Agent Diane Yu. She worked for a Joint Intelligence Coordination Office that Lena had not heard of in several years, and that she had not expected to encounter at a desert training base. She was not the only one surprised. Yu found her in the motor pool at 10:15, where Lena was helping Reese rewrap his knee before the day's operations resumed. Yu came around the front of the vehicle and stopped, and for a moment the two women looked at each other in the particular silence of people who are each deciding how much the other knows. "Nurse Voss," Yu said. "Agent Yu." Yu looked at Reese, who was trying to pretend he wasn't listening. "Could you give us a minute, soldier?" Reese looked at Lena. Lena nodded, and he left. Yu waited until his footsteps had faded before she spoke again. "Your duty report from last night was very detailed. I'm a detailed person. You identified a movement pattern. You described the subject's gait and bearing in terms that don't typically appear in a nurse's incident report." Lena finished stowing the elastic wrap. "I grew up in a rural area. You learn to watch how people move." Yu looked at her steadily. She was not going to argue with the answer. Lena could see that. She was collecting data points and would reach her own conclusions in her own time, which was exactly the kind of intelligence professional that was actually dangerous to try to manage. "The device on the communications truck," Yu said. The technician described the installation method as sophisticated. Fast, clean, minimal contact with surrounding surfaces. Whoever placed it knew the equipment. "That narrows it." "It does." Yu tilted her head slightly. "You reported the contact at 0344. The duty officer noted you were already dressed and carrying your weapon when you arrived." "I sleep light." Yu held her gaze for 3 seconds. "I'm sure you do," she said, and walked away. "Oh." Mallory called Lena into his office at 1100. The office was a partitioned section of the operations building, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, with a laminate map of the Halverson corridor pinned to one wall and a single window that faced the motor pool. Mallory was sitting behind the desk when she arrived, but he stood when she came in, which was either courtesy or a dominance calculation. With him it was difficult to know. "Close the door," he said. She closed it and stood across the desk from him. She did not sit, because he had not offered it, and she was not going to ask. Mallory looked at the desk for a moment, then he looked up. "I filed the conduct report yesterday. I want you to know that's not changing." "I understand, sir." "What I also want you to understand is that whatever happened last night, the contact you reported, the device on the truck, I'm not going to let that change the fact that you deviated from your assigned position and interfered with my command structure in a way that could have gotten people killed." Lena looked at him. "Could have," she said. "What?" "You said could have gotten people killed, not did. I want to make sure the report is accurate." Mallory's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." "It might be, sir. If the report is going to my commanding officer, accuracy seems relevant." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the calculation of whether this was insubordination or a legitimate procedural point, and she could see him arriving at the correct answer, which was that it was both, and that he couldn't cite one without inviting scrutiny of the other. "You're a nurse," he said finally. Whatever your file says, whatever Osteen's people think they found, here, in my unit, during my exercise, you are a nurse, and nurses do not second-guess combat decisions. What if they're right? Lena said. Mallory stared at her. What if the nurse is right and the combat decision is wrong? She said. Does the answer change? The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Dismissed, Mallory said. She left. The briefing for the resumed exercise was scheduled for 1300, which gave Lena 2 hours that she used to do 3 things. Eat, review the revised terrain maps that Osteen's team had distributed, and find Grund. She found him at the vehicle staging area, running through a pre-operation checklist with 2 of his people. She waited until he finished, and then fell into step beside him as he walked toward the briefing building. The listening device, she said, has Yu's team determined what frequencies it was monitoring? Classified, apparently. Then she knows. If she's not sharing the frequencies, she already knows which channels were compromised, and she doesn't want whoever placed it to know she knows. Grund considered this. That's a complicated sentence. It's a complicated situation. If the exercise route was leaked through the communications truck, and the same people who placed the device ran the movement in the canyon yesterday, then the resumed exercise is going into a corridor that the opposition has already had 24 hours to re-prepare. Osteen added the second platoon. The second platoon doesn't change the canyon geometry. The East Ridge still has the same observation platform. The North Wash still provides the same flanking approach. She paused. Have they swept the ridge? Grund stopped walking. No, he said. The perimeter sweep last night covered the base perimeter and the approach roads. Not the ridge. Lena looked toward the south, in the direction of the canyon they couldn't see from here. They should sweep the ridge before they send anyone back into that canyon. Grund looked at her for a moment, then looked south. I'll bring it up in the briefing. Mallory will dismiss it. Osteen won't. Lena nodded. They walked the rest of the way to the briefing building without speaking. Osteen ran the 1300 briefing, which was itself a signal. Mallory sat to her left and did not speak during the main portion of the presentation, which addressed the modifications to the exercise, additional personnel, revised communication protocols, a secondary evacuation route that used the Western Plateau access Lena had identified the day before. Osteen was precise and specific in a way that did not invite unnecessary questions, and the room had the quality of people paying attention because they had decided she was worth listening to. When Grund raised the ridge sweep, Osteen did not hesitate. She looked at her operations officer and said, add a sweep team to the pre-insertion element. East Ridge, full coverage before the main body enters the canyon. Mallory leaned toward her and said something quietly. Osteen listened, then said, at normal volume, noted, we sweep the ridge. After the briefing, you appeared at Lena's elbow as the room was clearing. You're on the medical support element again, she said. That's my assignment. I want you to carry a secondary radio on channel 7. Lena looked at her. That's not a standard platoon channel. No, you said. It's not. She held out a small radio, compact, different profile than the standard issue units. If you see something I need to know about, you call it directly to me, not through the platoon net. Mallory won't authorize a secondary radio. I'm not asking Mallory. You met her eyes. I'm asking you. Lena looked at the radio. She looked at you. You know who I am, she said. It was not a question. I know who your file says you are, you said, which is a different thing from knowing who you are. But it's enough for me to want your eyes on that ridge. Lena took the radio. She put it in her left breast pocket. Stay off the main channel unless it's medical, you said, and stay alive. She walked away, and Lena stood with the weight of the small radio against her ribs and thought about the ridge and the North Wash and the listening device and the way the movement in the canyon had been too clean for improvisation. So the insertion began at 1500. The ridge sweep team went in first, 6 soldiers from the 2nd platoon moving up the east face while the main body staged at the canyon entrance. The sweep took 38 minutes, which was 17 minutes longer than estimated, and the reason it took 17 minutes longer was that they found something. 2 fixed observation positions, recently occupied, with debris that included water bottles, energy bar wrappers, and what appeared to be a spotting scope mount bolted to a natural rock shelf. The scope itself was gone. The people who had been using it were gone. But they had been there recently enough that the water in one of the bottles was not yet warm from the desert heat. Osteen suspended the insertion and convened a fast conference at the canyon entrance. Herself, Mallory, the second platoon commander, and you. Lena stood 40 meters away with the medical support element and watched the conference through the same quality of attention she brought to everything. She watched Mallory's body language, which was tight and controlled in the way that people get when they are defending a position they are not sure of. She watched you, who was looking at something on a tablet and showing it to Osteen. She watched the canyon entrance, where the shadow line was moving as the afternoon progressed and the light shifted. In 3 hours it would be dark. Her radio crackled. Channel 7. Yu's voice, low and direct. Voss. The spotting scope mount was oriented south-southwest. What does that cover from the east ridge? Lena thought through the terrain geometry. The western plateau approach, she said, and the south access road. A pause. The route we added to the plan this morning. Yes. Another pause. Someone had this information before we revised the plan. Lena said nothing, because there was nothing to add. Stay close to the medical element, Yu said. Don't go into the canyon until I give you a direct instruction. The channel went quiet. Lena stood at the staging area and watched the conference continue, and thought about who had access to the revised plan and when the revised plan had been finalized, and how long it would take to communicate a spotting scope position from someone inside Fort Calder to someone on the East Ridge, and what that math produced when you worked it backward. She thought about Mallory, who had been present for the full plan revision and who had filed a conduct report on her that morning, and she thought about the specific kind of anger that made people file conduct reports, and whether anger was always just anger or whether it was sometimes also fear. She was still thinking about it when the shooting started. It did not come from the canyon, it came from the south. From the direction of the south access road, the route they had added to the plan that morning, the route that the spotting scope had been oriented to cover. 2 shots, sharp and flat in the desert air, then a third, then the unmistakable sound of a vehicle losing control. The pitch change of an engine under sudden stress, followed by impact, followed by silence. Osteen had her radio up before the echo finished. South Road, all units respond. South Road. Lena was already moving before the order was complete. She ran the 400 meters to the South Road access point in 3 minutes and 20 seconds, which was not fast by the standards of what she had once been able to do, but was considerably faster than anyone had expected from the medical support nurse. And she arrived at the scene to find one of the intelligence element's vehicles off the road and hard against a boulder, the front end compressed, the windshield cracked, and 2 people inside. The driver was unconscious. The passenger, one of Yu's colleagues, a man named Pratt, who Lena had seen briefly during the morning arrival, was conscious and trying to push the deployed airbag out of his face with a hand that was bleeding from a gash across the back. Lena got the passenger door open and had Pratt assessed in 90 seconds. Lacerations, possible wrist fracture, adrenaline making him louder and more combative than his injuries warranted. She moved to the driver, younger, dark hair, a head wound that was bleeding in the heavy way that head wounds bled, which looked worse than it usually was, but still needed to be managed immediately. She had both of them stabilized before the first platoon soldiers reached the vehicle. Pratt, who had stopped being combative the moment he registered what she was doing, said from behind the pressure bandage she'd pressed against his hand, "There were shooters on the ridge above the road." "How many?" "2, maybe 3. They hit the tires first." Lena looked at the tires. The front left was flat, not blown, shot. Precise shot. The driver had lost control trying to brake on loose gravel and gone into the boulder. "They weren't trying to kill you," she said. "They were trying to stop the vehicle." Pratt looked at her. "Why?" She didn't answer, because the answer required more context than she had time to give, and because answering it meant explaining what she thought they had been trying to stop the vehicle from doing, which was reaching the canyon entrance before someone else did. She pressed the Channel 7 radio. "You." "I'm here." "Pratt and your driver are stable. Tire shot. Controlled stop. They were not trying to kill your team. They were blocking the South Road." A pause. "Blocking it from which direction?" "From reaching the canyon. Whatever's happening in there, someone doesn't want your element getting to it." Yu's voice was very controlled when she spoke next. "Osteen is sending the 2nd platoon into the canyon now. Mallory is leading the 1st platoon in behind them." Lena stood up. She looked at the canyon entrance, which was 400 meters north. Who stayed behind at the staging area? A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Standard rear security, 2 soldiers. You. Lena was already moving north. Check your rear security, now. She ran. The staging area, when she reached it, had the specific wrong quality of a place that had been disrupted and quickly reordered by someone who didn't know exactly what order it had been in before. The 2 rear security soldiers were on the ground, not dead, zip-tied, weapons gone, each with a single precise strike to the back of the head that had dropped them without lasting damage. Beside the platoon's secondary equipment cache, a section of canvas had been moved and replaced at a slightly wrong angle, and when Lena lifted it, she found an empty space where the platoon's backup communications equipment had been staged. Not stolen, gone. And in its place, sitting on the ground in the shadow of the cache, was a single radio, not standard issue, not Fort Calder equipment, already transmitting on a frequency she didn't recognize. She did not touch it. She pressed channel 7. You. Rear security is down, non-lethal. Your backup comms are gone. She looked at the transmitting radio. And someone left something behind. The channel was quiet for 4 seconds. When you spoke, her voice had a quality in it that Lena recognized from a long time ago. The specific compression that happened in a person's voice when they realized the situation was larger than the frame they had put around it. Hold your position, you said. Do not touch anything. I know. Lena. It was the first time you had used her first name. It stopped her. Whatever's in that canyon right now, Mallory just led 40 soldiers into it, and I think he doesn't know what he walked them into. Lena looked north toward the canyon entrance. The shadow line had moved. The light was going amber and low, the way desert light went in the late afternoon, flattening everything and making distances deceptive. How long before your team could get air support over the canyon, she said. 30 minutes minimum. 30 minutes was a long time. You, she said. I'm going in. I said, hold your 40 soldiers, 2 of whom I already know have injuries that weren't fully treated because we moved too fast. If this goes bad in there, you need someone who can work trauma in the field without waiting for medevac authorization. She paused. And you need someone who can see what's happening and tell you where the pressure is coming from. A long pause. 6 seconds. 7. Channel 7 stays open, you said finally. You report everything. Copy. Lena slung the trauma kit, checked the rifle, and moved toward the canyon entrance at a run. She was 50 meters from the canyon mouth when she heard the first explosion from inside, deep, percussive, the kind that moved through stone rather than just air. And then the rifle fire began, overlapping and chaotic, bouncing off the canyon walls in ways that made it impossible to tell from the outside how many guns were firing or from which direction. She did not slow down. She pressed herself against the canyon wall just inside the entrance, let her eyes adjust to the shadow, and listened to the fire patterns the way she had been trained to listen to them years ago, in a life that her current personnel file described as classified, and her own memory described in considerably more specific terms. The fire was coming from 3 directions, not 2, not the 2 fixed positions the sweep team had found on the East Ridge. 3. Which meant there was a third element that had not been on the ridge when the sweep happened, which meant they had moved into position after the sweep cleared, which meant the timing had been coordinated with someone who knew when the sweep was happening. She pressed channel 7. 3 separate fire elements inside the canyon, East Ridge, canyon floor north, and she listened for 2 more seconds, tracking the echo patterns. The west cleft. They're in the western exit route. Yu's voice was tight. The secondary evacuation route. Yes. They planned around both routes. Yes, Lena said. They had the full plan. The fire intensified from the north. Someone was shouting, Mallory's voice, she thought, though the acoustics made it hard to be certain. She moved deeper into the canyon, staying on the wall, and came around the first bend to find 3 soldiers pinned behind a rock formation with fire coming from above and ahead simultaneously, 2 of them returning fire and 1 sitting against the rock with both hands pressed to his side, and the particular expression of someone who was deciding, second by second, whether to keep that information to themselves. She went to the one with his hands on his side first. Penetrating wound, left flank. Not arterial, the blood was dark and the pressure was holding, but it needed packing immediately and it needed evaluation she could not do in a canyon with rounds going overhead. She had it packed and dressed in 90 seconds, keeping herself below the rock line, talking to the soldier in the flat, specific way that kept people present when their body was trying to pull them somewhere else. "Name," she said. "Holloway." "Holloway. Stay with the pack. Don't let go of the pressure. Can you do that?" "Yeah." His voice was not steady, but it was there. "Good." She looked at the two soldiers returning fire. One of them turned briefly to look at her with the expression of someone trying to process how a nurse had arrived in their exact position during an active firefight. "How many forward of you?" she asked. "Half the first platoon," he said. "Captain Mallory's up ahead. They got hit from 3 sides about 4 minutes ago." "I know." She rose to a low crouch. "Hold this position. I'm going forward." The soldier stared at her. "You're going forward," she said. "Yes." She moved. What she found at the forward position was 40 meters deeper into the canyon, and it was worse than the sound had suggested. Mallory had pushed his element into a pinch point between 2 fire teams and had taken 3 casualties before he could pull back to a wider section of the canyon floor where the rock formations gave better cover. He had the remaining soldiers organized in a rough perimeter, but the western fire element was pushing south, which meant they were going to hit the perimeter from the flank in less than 10 minutes if nobody stopped them. Mallory saw her arrive, and his expression went through 3 different things in rapid succession: surprise, anger, and something that she recognized as a man who was in over his head and knew it and had not yet decided what to do about that knowledge. "What are you—" he started. 3 wounded forward of your position. Holloway is the worst, penetrating left flank, packed and stable. 2 others are mobile." She crouched behind the rock beside him and looked at the western approach. "Your flank is getting hit in 8 minutes. West element is moving south along the upper ledge." Mallory looked at her. His jaw was tight, and he was breathing harder than the exertion warranted, which meant the stress was doing the thing it did to people who were not accustomed to situations moving faster than their command structure. "I know," he said. "Do you have eyes on the west ledge?" "No." "Then how do you know?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Lena looked at the canyon. She looked at the positions of his soldiers, the cover available, the sight lines from the west ledge, and the gap in the perimeter that was sitting open like a door somebody had forgotten to close. She calculated the time it would take the western element to reach flanking position against the time it would take to move 2 of the perimeter soldiers to cover that gap, and the math was not complicated. "Captain," she said. He looked at her. "Move Reese and Corporal Witten to the west-facing rocks. Now. If that flank opens, you lose everyone on the north side of this position." Mallory stared at her for 2 full seconds. Around them, the canyon walls threw the sound of rifle fire back and forth until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Why should I listen to you?" he said. It was not a rhetorical question. He was genuinely asking, which was the first genuinely honest thing he had said to her since she arrived at Fort Calder. Lena looked at him steadily. "Because I'm right," she said. "And because you know it." Mallory held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he turned and shouted for Reese. Lena moved to the next casualty, and the canyon filled with the sound of soldiers repositioning, and somewhere above the east ridge a flare went up. Someone's flare. She didn't know whose. And in the sudden white light it threw down into the canyon, she could see the full shape of the situation for the first time. All 3 fire elements visible in their positions, and she understood in that moment exactly what this was, and who had planned it, and how deep the problem at Fort Calder actually went. She pressed channel 7. "You," she said. "Get Austin on this channel right now and tell her to look very carefully at who had access to the revised operation plan this morning." Static for 3 seconds. Then use voice, very quiet. "She's already looking." The flare burned out. The canyon went dark. And from somewhere in the rock above her, a new voice came over the platoon net. Calm, male, unhurried, speaking in a cadence that was not military, but that carried the specific authority of someone who had done this before, and said, "Fort Calder element, you are surrounded. Stand down your weapons, and we will discuss terms." Nobody moved. Lena looked at Mallory. Mallory looked at her. And for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Calder, Captain Derek Mallory did not tell her to stay out of it. The voice on the platoon net said nothing else after that. It didn't need to. The canyon did the rest, the walls throwing back every small sound, boots shifting on shale, Someone's breathing coming too fast, the distant creak of someone on the west ledge adjusting position. The silence after discuss terms was the kind designed to make people fill it with bad decisions, and Lena could see two soldiers near the north perimeter already looking at each other in the way people look at each other when they are about to do something they haven't fully thought through. "Nobody answers," she said quietly, not to Mallory but to Grund, who had materialized beside her in the darkness, with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent a long time learning to move without announcing himself. "Don't give them a voice on the net. They're trying to fix your position." Grund looked at her for half a second, then passed the word down the line in a murmur. Mallory was on his radio. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort that was costing him. "I was trying to reach Austin on the command channel and getting interference. Electronic, not atmospheric, which meant the transmitting device at the staging area had been doing exactly what she thought it had been doing when she found it. Primary command channel is jammed," she told him. He lowered the radio. "I know. Channel 7 is clean. It's not on the standard band." He looked at the small radio in her hand. She held it out. He took it without a word and pressed it. "Osteen, this is Mallory. Primary channel is jammed. I have wounded and I need air support coordinates. We are in the main canyon body, approximately 400 meters south of the entrance." Osteen's voice came back clear. "Copy, Mallory. Air assets are 18 minutes out. What's your casualty count?" Mallory looked at Lena. 4 confirmed," she said. "Holloway is the most critical. The others are mobile if we move carefully." He relayed it. Osteen said, "Hold position. Do not attempt to move the wounded until the air assets arrive." "Understood." He handed the radio back to Lena. There was something in the gesture, the returning of it, the acknowledgement that she had something he needed, that was not an apology but was adjacent to one. He didn't say anything, which was probably the right choice. Lena moved back to Holloway. He was still holding the pack. His color was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago, the gray undertone that happened when the body started making decisions about which systems to prioritize. And his breathing had the shallow, rapid quality that told her his body was working too hard to maintain what she had managed to hold stable. She checked the pack, checked the pressure, checked his pupils. "Still 2 fingers?" she said. "Still 2, he said. His voice was smaller than before. "Good. Don't let go of the pressure." "I'm not planning to." "I know you're not." She adjusted the pack slightly, applied additional pressure at the inferior margin where she could feel the seep was getting worse, and made the calculation that she had 18 minutes before the air assets arrived, and that Holloway had maybe 22 before the situation became significantly harder to reverse. The math was close enough to acceptable that she did not say it out loud. She moved back to Mallory. "Holloway needs to be out in 20 minutes. If the air assets are late, I need to start a field plasma line, and I need you to have 2 soldiers ready to move him on my signal. If we move him before the canyon is clear, if we don't move him in 20 minutes, we might not be moving him at all." She said it flatly, not cruelly, just accurately. "I'm not telling you to move him now. I'm telling you to be ready." Mallory held her gaze. "Okay," he said, but the Western fire element moved at 0047, which was 16 minutes after the voice on the net had offered terms and 8 minutes after Mallory had repositioned Reese and Witten to the west-facing rocks. The movement came fast, 3 individuals dropping from the upper ledge to a lower shelf position that put them at a 40-degree angle to Reese's position. And the exchange that followed was brief and very loud, and ended with 2 of the 3 pulling back and 1 staying on the ledge in a way that suggested he was no longer making decisions for himself. Reese's arm was bleeding when he came back to the perimeter. Not badly, a graze across the forearm, the kind of wound that looked alarming and was mostly drama. But he was holding it against his side with the tight, careful expression of someone trying to determine how bad it was by how much it hurt. "Sit," Lena told him. "I'm fine." "I know. Sit anyway." He sat. She had the wound cleaned and dressed in 4 minutes, working by feel as much as sight, because the light in the canyon was down to ambient starlight and the residual glow of whatever the flare had left on the retinas. Reese watched her work with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by her some time ago and had arrived at a different state, which was closer to simple attention. "You've done this before," he said. "I'm a nurse." "Not like this." She tied off the bandage. "Like what?" Reese looked at the canyon wall. "Like someone who doesn't have to think about it." She didn't answer. and he didn't push it, and she moved on to the next soldier who needed her. The eastern element was the problem. The East Ridge fire had been suppressing rather than advancing, keeping the platoon's heads down, limiting their ability to identify the western approach, coordinating without engaging directly. That kind of discipline was the signature of a team with a specific objective that was not simply to inflict casualties. They were managing the situation. Moving pieces. The voice on the net, the jamming of the command channel, the device at the staging area, the disabled rear security, the blocked south road. It was not chaos. It was architecture. Someone had built this. Lena pressed channel 7. The East Ridge element is fire suppression, not assault. They're managing the platoon's movement. What are they trying to prevent you from reaching? Static, then Yu's voice with the slight delay that told her the signal was being routed somewhere unusual. We're working on that. The original exercise scenario, the simulated downed reconnaissance element. Where was the notional location? A pause. Southern Canyon terminus, about 800 meters south of the main body's current position. Is there anything actually at the southern terminus? A longer pause. There's an equipment cache, Yu said, pre-positioned for the exercise. It was logged as training materials, but the counterintelligence team flagged it 2 hours ago. We haven't been able to verify the contents because the south approach is blocked. Lena looked south. The canyon bent about 200 meters ahead, obscuring the terminus. The eastern fire element was positioned to make movement south extremely difficult for anyone not willing to take casualties. The western element had just tried to close off the flank. Nobody had made a serious push to actually enter the platoon's perimeter and take ground. They were not trying to defeat the platoon. They were trying to keep it from moving south. The cache, Lena said. Someone doesn't want Osteen's people to reach it. That's our assessment, yes. How important is it? The pause this time was long enough that it was its own answer. Get someone to that terminus, Yu said. Small element, fast, while the main body holds the fire teams in place. They can't cover both simultaneously. Mallory won't split his element. Then you go. Lena looked at the canyon. She looked at Mallory, who was managing his perimeter with the focused, controlled attention of a man who had found, under pressure, a version of himself that was better than the one that had filed a conduct report that morning. She looked at Grund, who was watching her from 10 meters away with the patient expression of someone who had already calculated what she was thinking and was waiting to see what she decided. I need one person, she said to Grund. Grund looked at her for 2 seconds. Me, he said. You're senior NCO. Mallory needs you here. Witten, then. Witten's on the west position. Reese. She looked at Reese, who had heard his name and was already looking at them with the alert, willing expression of someone who had decided somewhere in the last 3 hours that he was on her side. His arm was dressed. His knee was wrapped. He was upright and functional, which was all that the next 10 minutes required. Can you move fast? She said. Yes. I mean actually fast. Not, I'm a soldier and I'll manage fast. Fast. Reese almost smiled. Yes, he said. I need to move south. The terminus cache is why they're running this. If we reach it before they can clear out or destroy it, Yu's team has what they need. Mallory stared at her. I can't authorize you to move south through active fire. I'm not asking you to authorize it. I'm telling you what I'm doing. She held his gaze. But I need the east element suppressed for 60 seconds while Reese and I get past the bend. Can you do that? Mallory looked at the perimeter. He looked at the canyon bend. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was having a rapid, silent argument with himself about several things at once. 60 seconds, he said. That's all I need. If you take a round out there, then I take a round. She checked the rifle. Have Grund ready for fire suppression east on my signal. Channel 3, single click. She didn't wait for him to say anything else. Up. The run to the canyon bend was the most exposed 50 meters of ground she had covered in years, and she was aware of it in the specific clinical way that she was aware of most things under pressure, not emotionally, just factually, a continuous assessment of variables that she had no conscious experience of choosing to run. Reese was behind her and to the right, moving with the disciplined, low profile of someone who had done enough training that the body knew what to do without being told. She clicked channel 3 once. Mallory's suppression opened up from the perimeter, 6 rifles pouring fire toward the east ridge simultaneously, enough noise and muzzle flash to force anyone on that ridge below their cover line for at least 45 seconds. She and Reese moved. They reached the bend in 31 seconds. She pressed herself against the canyon wall and listened. Reese arrived 2 seconds behind her, breathing controlled, eyes wide but steady. The terminus was another 160 meters south. The canyon here was wider, the walls lower, which meant better sight lines in both directions but less cover. She could see the rough shape of the terminus, a flat widening where the canyon dead-ended against a natural rock barrier, and against that barrier, a collection of cases and containers stacked with the purposeful organization of equipment that had been placed deliberately, not left. No movement, no fire from this direction, but there were 2 figures near the cache, not soldiers, not the opposition team from the fire elements above. These were people in civilian clothes moving quickly and purposefully around the cache, and one of them was carrying what looked like a demolition initiator, which meant they were planning to destroy the contents, which meant the contents were worth destroying. "Don't fire," she said to Reese. Her voice was very quiet. "They see muzzle flash. They trigger the initiator." Reese saw what she saw. His jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" "We get it closer." "That's your plan?" "Yes." They moved along the south wall using the rock irregularities for cover, closing the distance in stages while the sounds of the engagement behind them continued to mask their movement. At 80 meters, she could make out the faces of the 2 figures, both male, both moving with the focused, task-oriented efficiency of people on a timeline. The one with the initiator was talking to the other, gesturing at the cache. At 60 meters, the second figure looked up. He looked directly at her position. She froze. Reese froze. The figure looked away. She exhaled. At 40 meters, she stopped and made the assessment. 2 individuals, one weapon visible on the closer figure's hip, the initiator in the hands of the second. The cache contained, she looked at the case markings as clearly as she could from this distance. Communications equipment, document cases, and what appeared to be a computer server unit. The kind of thing that would be very interesting to a counterintelligence team and very damaging to whoever had left it here. "When I move, you cover the one on the left," she told Reese. "Don't fire unless he reaches for the weapon. If the initiator gets triggered, the cache burns and we've done this for nothing. And if one of them runs, let them." She checked the rifle one more time. "Ready?" "No," Reese said. "Good, go." She crossed the open ground at speed, covering the 40 meters before the closer figure fully registered what was happening, and she had the rifle on the initiator carrier before he finished turning around. "Put it down," she said. Her voice was exactly the volume it needed to be, not shouted, not soft, the specific register that cut through the noise in a person's head when everything was moving fast. "Right now, put it on the ground." The figure looked at her. He was perhaps 40, with a face that was working through several calculations simultaneously. His hand tightened on the initiator. "I will take that arm before you finish the motion," she said. "Put it down." He put it down. Reese had the second figure against the canyon wall with his rifle at contact distance, and the professional expression of someone who had found, under real pressure, that his training was there after all. Lena moved to the initiator and kicked it 6 feet away from the figure's reach. She zip-tied his wrists with the restraints from her kit, then went to Reese and tied the second figure. She pressed Channel 7. "You, South Terminus. 2 in custody. Cache is intact." The pause was shorter this time. "Copy. Hold position. Do not let anyone near the cache." "Understood." She looked at the cases stacked against the rock barrier. "What's in the server unit?" Yu's voice was careful. "Signals, intercepts. 18 months of communication between elements inside Fort Calder and an external intelligence collection network." Lena looked at the server. She looked at the 2 men on the ground. She thought about the listening device on the communications truck. She thought about the spotting scope mount oriented toward the plan they had finalized that morning. She thought about who had been in the room when the revised plan was created. "You," she said. "Is Mallory's name in those intercepts?" Another pause. Longer. "No," Yu said, "but someone else's is." The air assets arrived at 19 minutes, which was 1 minute over the estimate, and the change in the canyon was immediate. The fire from the east ridge stopped within 40 seconds of the helicopters cresting the canyon walls, and the western element did not wait at all, pulling back from the upper ledge before the aircraft had finished their first pass. The voice on the platoon net did not speak again. Lena heard it all from the south terminus, where she sat on a supply case between the 2 restrained figures and waited. Reese stood nearby, watching the canyon bend, his rifle down but his attention fully north. When Grund came around the bend with 4 soldiers from the 2nd platoon, his expression when he saw her sitting there was one of the more gratifying things she had seen in a long time. "Clear," she said. Grund looked at the 2 figures. He looked at the cache. He looked at her. "How?" he said. 40 meters of open ground at speed, she said. Reese covered the flanks. Grund looked at Reese. Reese looked at the canyon wall with the careful expression of someone who was trying not to appear as pleased with himself as he was. "The cache is intact," Lena told Grund. "Use people need to process it before anyone moves anything." "Understood." He pulled his radio and relayed the information to Osteen. Lena stood up and walked back toward the main body. Her knee was complaining. She had hit it against a rock during the run south and had not registered it at the time, which was how that worked, and which meant it would register loudly later. She noted it and set it aside. Holloway was the first thing she checked when she reached the perimeter. I was still conscious, which was better than she had feared, and the medevac team that had come down with the helicopters was already working on him with the equipment she did not have in the field kit. She stepped back and let them work, which was a discipline that required more effort than the running had. The 2nd platoon commander was a compact, serious-faced major named Albright, who arrived at the perimeter 3 minutes after his soldiers and went immediately to Mallory. Lena watched the exchange from a distance. It was brief and apparently not comfortable for either of them, which was probably appropriate given the circumstances. When Albright walked away, Mallory stood alone at the north perimeter for a long moment before turning and locating her in the group. He walked toward her with the deliberate quality of a man who had decided to do something he was not comfortable doing. "The cache," he said, "intact." "You went south during an active engagement." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Without authorization." "Yes." His jaw moved. "That's twice." "I know." "And both times—" He stopped. He looked at the canyon floor. He looked at the helicopters visible above the canyon rim, their lights moving in slow arcs. He looked at her. "Both times you were right," he said. He said it like it cost him something, which it did. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," she said. "That's not why I did it." "Then why?" She looked at the medevac team still working on Holloway. "Because Holloway is 23, she said. "And Reese already had a bad knee before tonight. And Kessler in the first incident needed a pressure bandage that nobody else was positioned to give him." She looked back at Mallory. "That's why." Mallory was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the canyon was filling with soldiers from the 2nd platoon, with U's people moving toward the south terminus, with the particular organized activity of a situation that had been very bad and was now, incrementally, becoming less bad. "There's going to be an investigation," Mallory said. "Yes." "Into everything, the cache, the device on the truck, the leak in the planning cycle." He paused. "My conduct report is going to look—" He stopped again. "Like what it was," she said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He held her gaze. He was a man who was working through something in real time, and she could see the effort of it in his face, the recalibration happening whether he wanted it to or not, the world not being quite the shape he had believed it was. "Your file," he said. "How much of it is real?" "All of it," she said. "The unclassified parts just don't tell the whole story." He nodded slowly. "What's the classified part?" "The part where I was right before, and someone decided that was inconvenient." Mallory absorbed that. He didn't push further, which was probably the wisest decision he had made since she arrived. You appeared at the south terminus side of the perimeter and waved twice. Osteen, who had come down from the plateau with the second wave of assets, walked toward her. Lena watched the 2 women meet at the canyon bend and begin speaking rapidly, U's tablet between them, both of them looking at it with the focused intensity of people who had found something they had been looking for. Grund appeared at Lena's shoulder. "U's team cracked the server," he said quietly. Osteen's face when she read the first file. "What did it look like?" "Like someone who had just understood a very large problem." Lena looked at Osteen, who had stopped speaking and was standing very still while U continued talking. "How large?" she said. "Large enough that she made a call on the satellite phone immediately after," Grund said. "Not to regional command." Lena turned to look at him. "Above regional," Grund said. She was quiet for a moment. The helicopters above the canyon rim were moving again, not departing, repositioning, which meant they had received updated instructions. The medevac carrying Holloway lifted and turned north. Two of the soldiers who had been in the East Ridge fire had been brought down and were sitting against the canyon wall being assessed by the medevac team's secondary element. "The intercepts," she said. "The 18 months of signals that you mentioned." "Yes." "How far up does it go?" Grund looked at her with the patience he always brought to things that didn't have clean answers. "I think that's what Austin is finding out right now," he said. Lena watched Austin, who was still on the satellite phone, whose expression had not changed from the stillness it had arrived at when you showed her the first file. "Iron Wraith," Grund said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had been patient long enough and had decided, with the same care he brought to everything, that it was time to stop. "That's what I found in your file," he said. "The one section that wasn't redacted. A call sign, Iron Wraith, and a citation for an action in a desert engagement 3 years ago that saved 11 soldiers from a compromised reconnaissance team." He paused. "Followed by a disciplinary finding that removed you from special operations duty." Lena said nothing. "The citation said you identified a threat before your command element did, took independent action, and preserved the team." Grund's voice was not accusing. It was simply quiet and factual, the way it always was. "The disciplinary finding said you disobeyed a direct order." "Both of those things are true," she said. "What was the order?" She was quiet for a long moment. The canyon around them was full of movement, full of the sounds of a situation being resolved. Soldiers moving and radios transmitting, and the distant pulse of helicopter rotors. All of it felt very far away. "To stop," she said. "The order was to stop." Grund waited. "There was a man," she said, "non-combatant. He was going to be executed. The order from my commanding officer was to withdraw the team and not intervene because intervention would compromise the operation." She looked at the canyon wall. "I intervened. And saved him. And was removed from the program." She said it without bitterness, just as a sequence of events, which was how she had learned to carry it. The commanding officer filed the disciplinary finding. "It's in my file. What's not in my file is the evidence that he had authorized the operation that created the situation in the first place, that the non-combatant was going to be executed because of decisions he made, and that my intervention exposed those decisions." She looked at Grund. That part was classified. His part, the part that explained why the order to stop made sense to him. Grund was quiet for a long time. "Where is he now?" he said. Lena looked at Osteen, who was still on the satellite phone, whose face was still very still. "I don't know," she said. "But I think you might." She started walking toward Osteen. She was 15 meters away when Osteen lowered the satellite phone and turned, and their eyes met across the canyon floor. And Osteen's expression was the specific expression of someone who had just understood several things simultaneously. About the cache, about the intercepts, about the woman walking toward her, and about what all three of those things had in common. Osteen said nothing until Lena was 3 meters away. Then she said, very quietly, "The officer who filed the disciplinary finding on Iron Wraith 3 years ago." Lena stopped. "His name is in the server," Osteen said. "He's been running the collection network for 18 months, she paused. "And he is currently assigned to this regional command." The canyon was very quiet. "He has access to every operation plan filed through this base," Osteen said, "including this exercise." She looked at Lena with the expression of someone putting the last piece of something into place. "He knew you were here," Lena held Osteen's gaze. "He knew I was here," she said. "Yes. And the operation in the canyon tonight was not about the exercise," Osteen said. "The cache was leverage. The intercepts in that server." She stopped, and in the stopping, Lena understood the rest of it. The server didn't just contain 18 months of collected signals. It contained something specific, something about Iron Wraith, something that the man who had filed the disciplinary finding had been sitting on for 3 years, and that he had needed to retrieve or destroy before anyone else could read it. Something that proved the disciplinary finding was not about her insubordination at all. Osteen looked at her steadily. "I need to know everything," she said, "from the beginning." Behind them, Yu was walking toward the canyon with a document case under her arm and 2 counterintelligence officers at her side. moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who had found what they came for and were now taking it somewhere safe. Lena looked at the case. Somewhere in there was 3 years of her life, and the name of the man who had taken it, and the evidence that he had done it to protect himself. "How much time do we have?" she said. Osteen looked at the satellite phone in her hand. "The team that's going to his office has 30 minutes before he gets the notification that the server was recovered." She met Lena's eyes. "So we need to move now." And from somewhere above the canyon rim, not a helicopter, not a radio, but a sound that Lena recognized before she could name it, the specific acoustic signature of a precision rifle firing from a significant distance, a single shot rang out. "You dropped." "You" went down hard, the document case skidding across the shale as she hit the canyon floor, and Lena was moving before the echo of the shot had finished traveling the canyon walls. She covered the distance in 4 strides, dropped beside you, and had her hands on her in the same motion. Entry wound, right shoulder, high and lateral. Not a kill shot, not at that angle, which meant either the shooter had made an error or the shooter had not been trying to kill her. Lena pressed her palm against the wound and applied direct pressure while she ran the assessment. Exit wound present, which was better than the alternative. No arterial spray. You was conscious and trying to sit up, which was the specific stubbornness of someone who understood what lying still in an open area meant when there was a shooter with a position. "Stay down," Lena said. I know, stay down anyway." She looked up at the canyon rim. The shot had come from above, northwest, based on the angle of entry, which put the shooter somewhere on the western rim that the 2nd Platoon had not cleared because the 2nd Platoon had come in from the east. She pressed channel 7 with the hand that wasn't holding pressure on Yu's shoulder. "Shooter on the west rim, northwest quadrant. Canyon floor is exposed. I need suppression on the northwest rim now." Albright's voice responded immediately. He had taken channel 7 from Mallory at some point in the last 20 minutes, which was itself a signal about how the command structure had shifted. "Copy. Suppression going up. Get the casualty to the east wall." Lena looked at the east wall. 30 meters of open ground. Yu weighed maybe 60 kilograms and was doing her best to be cooperative, but was also losing blood at a rate that made 30 meters of open ground a non-trivial problem. She looked at Reese, who had come south when the shot fired and was crouched 3 meters away behind a boulder. "Cover left," she said. "Move when I move." "Ready," Reese said. She got her hands under Yu's left arm and shoulder. "This is going to hurt," she told her. "Everything hurts," Yu said. "Fair enough." The suppression fire from Albright's element opened up on the northwest rim, and Lena moved. 30 meters, 30 seconds. Yu's weight distributed across Lena's right side, both of them moving as low as the terrain allowed, which was not very low. Reese moved parallel on the left, his rifle up, watching the rim. One round hit the shale behind them, not from the northwest, from a different position entirely, eastern rim, which meant there were 2 shooters, or the northwest shooter, had moved faster than the suppression should have allowed. They reached the east wall. Lena set Yu down against the rock and went back to the wound. The entry channel was clean enough that she could pack it without probing, which she did, working fast and efficiently, feeling the adrenaline in her hands that was familiar and manageable because she had learned long ago that adrenaline was information, not instruction. She tied the pack off, checked Yu's blood pressure by feel, radial pulse present, strong enough, rate elevated, and made the assessment that the wound was survivable with current management for the next 30 minutes. "The document case," Yu said. "It's in the middle of the canyon floor. That case cannot be left out there." "I know." Lena looked at it. The case had slid 8 meters from where Yu had dropped it. Not far, but far enough to be an open ground with no cover between it and whatever was on the west rim. "Who else knows what's in it?" "The server contents were transferred before we moved. There are copies." Yu paused for a controlled breath. "But the case has physical documents, original reports, things that can't be reproduced because the originals were kept off-system intentionally." Lena looked at the case. She looked at the rim. She looked at Reese, who was watching her with the expression he had settled into over the course of the last several hours, which was a kind of trusting readiness that was different from blind following. He had watched her be right enough times that he had arrived at a working theory, and the theory was that she generally knew what she was doing. "Cover position," she told him. "East wall, 10 meters south. If anything comes off that rim, you see it before I do. Reese moved. Lena moved toward the case. She went flat to the ground and covered the 8 meters in a low crawl that distributed her profile across the maximum available surface, which reduced her as a target to the point where hitting her would require luck more than skill. The west rim above stayed quiet. The suppression from Albright's element was pinning something. She could hear the fire continuing, which meant the target was still there and had not moved. She reached the case, got her hand on it, and pulled it toward her. A round hit the rock 6 inches from her left hand. Not from the west rim, the eastern position again. She moved back at speed, no longer concerned with profile, just distance, and reached the east wall with the case, and with a shallow graze across her left forearm where the rock fragment from the near miss had cut her. Not a bullet wound, just debris, though it bled more than she would have preferred. She set the case against Yu's leg and did not look at the arm. "Got it," she said. Yu looked at her arm. "You're rock, not around." She pressed the arm briefly against her side and focused on Yu. "The eastern position. Where's Albright's suppression targeted?" "West." "The east rim had a second shooter. He's not being suppressed." Yu's face tightened. She pressed channel 7 herself, which required moving her right arm and produced a sound that was not a word. She handed the radio to Lena. Lena pressed it. "Albright, you have a second shooter east rim, approximately 150 meters north of my position. West suppression can continue, but someone needs to address the east." "Working on it," Albright said. "Work faster," she said, and handed the radio back to Yu. The east rim position was neutralized 8 minutes later by a helicopter element that came in from the north at low altitude and put a spotlight on the position long enough for the shooter to make a decision about whether to stay or run. He ran. He did not run fast enough. Lena heard it on the radio and did not feel particularly satisfied, which was not because she was emotionally detached, but because satisfaction was not useful, and because there were still 3 soldiers in the canyon who needed assessment, and because Yu was going to need a surgical facility within the next 2 hours if the wound was going to resolve cleanly rather than complicatedly. She pressed channel 7. "Yu needs medevac, not field hospital, surgical." Osteen's voice, not Albright's. "Helicopter is inbound, 4 minutes." Lena looked at Yu, who was holding the document case against her side with her good arm, and watching Lena with an expression that was partly pain and partly something more deliberate. "The man whose name is in the server," Yu said. Her voice was measured. She was managing the pain with the controlled breathing of someone who had been trained to function through discomfort. "Colonel Marcus Hendren, Regional Command, Operations Division." The name landed with the particular weight of something that had been expected and was still, when it arrived, startling. "He filed my disciplinary finding," Lena said. "He did more than that." Yu looked at the document case. "The physical documents in this case include original field reports from the operation 3 years ago, the ones he suppressed. They show that the non-combatant you intervened to save had been placed in that position by Hendren's authorization. He was a source, and Hendren burned him when he became a liability. You weren't insubordinate. You stopped an extrajudicial execution of a man that Hendren had decided was worth more dead than alive." Yu paused for another controlled breath. "The disciplinary finding was filed to prevent you from making that case through official channels." Lena was quiet. "You knew some of this," Yu said. It was not a question. "I knew the shape of it, not the specifics." "The specifics are all in there." Yu tapped the case. 18 months of intercepts, the original field reports, and Hendren's communications with the external collection network. He's been selling operational intelligence for money and for protection. People who have things they could expose about his decisions 3 years ago, and people who needed what he knew about current operations. She looked at Lena directly. Tonight was about this case. He knew the counterintelligence team was going to find the cache because someone on his network told him. He sent the teams into the canyon to create enough chaos that his people could reach the cache first and destroy it. "And the shot that hit you was meant to destroy the case," Yu said. "I was secondary." Lena looked at the case. Then she looked up at the canyon rim, which was quiet now. "He's going to run." Osteen's people are at his office. If he knew the cache was recovered, he knew that was coming. Yu's expression shifted. "How fast can he move?" "Faster than you think. He didn't build 18 months of a parallel network by being slow." Lena stood. "Where does Osteen have eyes on him?" "Last confirmed location was Regional Command Headquarters, 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes was enough time to not be at Regional Command Headquarters anymore. Lena pressed Channel 7. Osteen, Hendren's location. Do you have confirmation he's still at Regional Command? A pause that was 3 seconds too long. He left the building 22 minutes ago, Osteen said. Her voice was controlled in the specific way of someone who was controlling it. He told his aide he was responding to the situation at Fort Calder. He's coming here, Lena said. There's no reason he would. The server is here. The documents are here. And he knows that destroying digital copies requires physical access to the drive, not just the originals. She looked at you. Are there components in that case that would help him if he had them? Not destroy what we know, but complicate the evidence chain? Yu's face did something that confirmed it before she spoke. There are authentication documents, she said. Chain of custody records for the intercepts. Without them, the server contents are admissible, but the evidentiary foundation takes longer to establish. Months, maybe. Long enough for a competent defense to— Long enough, Lena said. She looked at the medevac helicopter that was now visible above the canyon's southern rim, lights descending. She looked at the canyon entrance 400 meters north, where the soldiers from both platoons were managing the aftermath of the engagement. She looked at Grund, who had appeared at the east wall position with 2 soldiers from the 2nd platoon, and was watching her with the patient attention he always brought. He'll come in as authority, she told Grund. He's a colonel at regional command responding to an incident. Anyone who doesn't know the full picture will defer to him. How many people here know the full picture? Lena thought through it. Osteen knew. You knew. Albright knew pieces of it. Mallory knew almost none of it. Knew there was something in the server, knew it was significant, but not the specifics. Not enough, she said. Grund looked at her. What do you need? I need to get you on that helicopter with the documents. She looked at the document case. And I need to be at the canyon entrance before Hendren gets there. That's 2 things in 2 different places. Yes. Grund considered this for exactly the time it took him to determine it was not a solvable problem by simple division of effort. Then he said, I'll get you to the helicopter. Witten goes with her. He stays with that case until it's in Osteen's hands. And Reese. Grund looked at Reese, who was 10 meters away and had been listening with the quiet attention he brought to everything now. Reese goes with you, Grund said. It was not a question. Yes, Lena said. She was already moving north. She reached the canyon entrance in 6 minutes, which was not fast enough to be comfortable but was fast enough to be useful, and she arrived to find the perimeter organized but relaxed in the specific way that perimeters got relaxed after a threat was assessed as neutralized. The soldiers were managing equipment, moving casualties, talking to each other in the low voices of people who were coming down from a significant amount of adrenaline. Nobody was watching the north approach. Nobody was watching for a colonel arriving in a command vehicle with the correct credentials and a legitimate reason to be there. She found Mallory at the north edge of the perimeter. Hendren, she said. Colonel Marcus Hendren, Regional Command Operations. He's going to arrive in the next 10 to 20 minutes. Do not let him inside this perimeter. Mallory stared at her. He's senior to Osteen. He's the man who ran the collection network that did all of this tonight. His name is in the server. You're certain? You confirmed it. The documents confirm it. Osteen knows. Get her on Channel 7 right now, and she'll tell you the same thing. Mallory reached for the radio. He pressed Channel 7 and said, Colonel Osteen, this is Mallory at the canyon entrance. Nurse Voss is telling me Hendren is coming here. Can you confirm? Osteen's voice came back immediately. Confirmed. Hendren is not to be given access to any recovered materials or personnel. Consider him a person of interest. Do not detain him with force unless he attempts to remove evidence or personnel from the scene. I need that done correctly, or the evidentiary chain gets complicated. Acknowledge. Mallory looked at Lena. He acknowledged. He stood for a moment with the radio in his hand and the expression of a man who is revising a large number of things simultaneously. A colonel, he said. Yes. 18 months. At least. And tonight was to destroy the evidence before the counterintelligence team could secure it. She looked at the north approach. He's going to arrive appearing to be in charge. He's going to cite his authority. He's going to be very calm and very specific, and he's going to sound completely reasonable. How do I stop him from accessing the site without force? You don't stop him. You slow him down. You're managing a multi-casualty incident. Processing takes time. Documentation takes time. You need to verify credentials through the proper channel, which means through Austin, and Austin is currently occupied. She met his eyes. You know how to make process slow. Every officer does. Mallory almost said something that was not quite a smile. Yes, he said. We do. He turned and began organizing the perimeter with the specific focused attention that she had come to recognize as the better version of him, the version that existed when his ego was not in the room competing with the situation. Lena moved to a position on the east side of the entrance where the rock formation gave cover and a clear sight line to the north approach road. Reese took a position opposite, covering the west side. They did not discuss it. The arrangement was obvious and they had both arrived at it simultaneously, which was the kind of operational shorthand that developed between people who had been through enough together to stop needing words for the basic things. She waited. The vehicle arrived 14 minutes later. A command SUV, dark, the small flags of regional command on the front corners. It came in at a controlled speed, not rushing, which was itself a performance. Rushing communicated desperation. Coming in at regular speed communicated authority and belonging. Colonel Marcus Hendren was 61, silver-haired, with the upright bearing of a career officer and a face that had learned over decades to present exactly what it needed to present in any given situation. He got out of the vehicle and surveyed the perimeter with the expression of a senior officer arriving to assess an incident, which was exactly what he looked like and exactly what he was not. Mallory went to meet him. Lena watched. The exchange was not audible at this distance, but the body language was. Hendren presented something, credentials probably, and then spoke, gesturing toward the canyon. Mallory listened. He responded. He gestured back toward the vehicle, toward the documentation process, toward the North Road. He was buying time in exactly the way she had asked him to, and he was doing it competently, which she noted without surprise because she had stopped being surprised by Mallory's competence once she had seen it operate without his defensiveness getting in the way. Hendren's expression shifted once, a brief controlled tightening when Mallory said something that indicated the documentation process would take longer than expected. The tightening was small. Most people would not have seen it. Lena saw it. She pressed Channel 7. Austin, Hendren is at the perimeter. Mallory is holding him. How long do you need? The team at his office found a secondary access, Osteen said. A separate comms channel he was running out of a storage room adjacent to his office. We're pulling it now. 20 minutes to have it fully documented. 20 minutes. She looked at Hendren, who was still talking to Mallory, whose body language had shifted slightly. Less performance, more push. The controlled pressure of a man who was running a timeline of his own. He's going to request access to the canyon, she said, to assist with the investigation. Don't let Mallory authorize it alone. Albright is your authority on scene until I get there, Osteen said. Tell him. She found Albright and relayed the instruction. He received it with the direct, uncomplicated acceptance of an officer who had spent the evening learning to take useful information from whatever source it came from. Hendren got past Mallory at minute 11, which was not a failure. 11 minutes of delay in a situation where he had full authority to be present was a significant achievement, and the way he got past Mallory was not by force, but by invoking his rank in terms specific enough that Mallory had no procedural basis for continued delay. Lena had anticipated this. She had told Mallory to delay, not to stop. Hendren walked into the perimeter with 2 aides from the command vehicle, which was 2 more people than he needed if his purpose was assessment, and exactly the right number if his purpose was something else. She watched where he walked. He did not go toward the casualty collection point. He did not go toward Albright, who was the ranking officer on scene. He went south, toward the canyon mouth, moving with the purposeful calm of a man who knew where he was going. She moved to intercept. She came around the south side of the equipment staging area and placed herself between Hendren and the canyon entrance at a distance of 15 meters. And she waited while he covered the distance. And when he stopped and looked at her, there was a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, where the performance slipped and something else was visible underneath it. Recognition. Not of her as a nurse, not of her as a soldier attached to the Fort Calder exercise. Recognition of her specifically, the way you recognize someone you had thought about in a particular context for a long time. Nurse Voss, he said. He recovered the performance quickly. He was very good at it. Colonel, she said, I wasn't aware you were part of this exercise. I was attached to the medical support element. Temporarily. He said the word with the specific inflection of a man reminding both of them of a fact he considered relevant. "Everything is temporary," she said. He looked at the canyon entrance behind her. He looked at the two aides who had stopped 2 meters to his left. He looked back at her. "I need to assess the recovered materials," he said. "I've been briefed by my staff on the nature of the cache. As Regional Operations Commander, the contents fall under my authority." "Colonel Osteen has assumed direct authority over the recovered materials," Lena said. "She's en route." I outrank Osteen. In most circumstances. In a counterintelligence operation, the intelligence authority supersedes operational rank. Use team falls outside your command structure. Something moved in Hendren's eyes. It was not anger. He was too controlled for visible anger. It was calculation, rapid and precise, the kind that happened when a man who was very good at planning encountered a variable that had not been in his plan. "You have no standing to—" "I'm not detaining you, sir," she said. "I'm informing you that Colonel Osteen has designated the recovered materials as restricted access pending formal evidence processing. If you'd like to formally request access, the channel is through her." She met his eyes. "Which you know. You just hoped to be past this point before she arrived." The canyon was very quiet around them. 2 soldiers from the perimeter had drifted south, not obviously, not in a way that looked deliberate, but they were there, and they were watching. Hendren looked at her for a long moment. "Iron Wraith," he said. He said it quietly, not quite a card played, more like a weight set on a table to see how the table responded. "That's a classified call sign," she said. "It is." He held her gaze. "I classified it." "You did," she said, "along with everything else you didn't want anyone to read." The performance had gone now. Not replaced by emotion, he was not the kind of man who led with emotion, but replaced by something more honest, which was the specific face of a man who had run a very complex operation for a very long time, and was now standing at the moment where the complexity was not going to be enough. "What you think you know," he said, "is going to be very difficult to prove." "Difficult," she said. "Not impossible." "The server contents require authentication. Without the chain of custody documents—" "The case is with you," Lena said. "She's in surgical care. The case went with her." She paused. "All of it." Hendren went very still. "The helicopter lifted 8 minutes ago," she said. "It's already past your reach." She watched him calculate. She watched him run the remaining options and arrive at the inventory of what was left and what it meant. He was a man who had survived as long as he had by understanding when a position was tenable and when it was not, and she could see the moment when the calculation resolved. He looked past her toward the canyon. He looked at the soldiers who had drifted into position around them. He looked at the 2 aides who had understood, in the last 30 seconds, that something was significantly wrong with the situation they had accompanied him into. "I want to speak to Osteen directly," he said. "She'll be here in 12 minutes, Lena said. "Then I'll wait," he said. He said it as though waiting were a choice he was making, which it was not, and they both knew it, and the knowing was its own kind of resolution. He walked to the perimeter's eastern edge and stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the expression of a man who was simply waiting, which was the last version of the performance he had left. Lena turned away. Reese was 3 meters behind her. He had been there for most of the conversation, which she had been aware of and which had been useful in ways that were more practical than ceremonial. "That's him," Reese said. It was not a question. "Yes." "He doesn't look like—" Reese stopped. "Like what?" Reese thought about it. "Like someone who would do all of that." "They rarely do," she said. She walked to the north end of the perimeter and sat on a supply case and finally, for the first time in several hours, stopped moving. Her knee was louder now than it had been. The sustained activity had aggravated whatever she had done to it on the run south. And the graze on her forearm was stiffening in the cooling night air. She checked the improvised wrap she had put on it, found it adequate, and left it alone. Grund arrived from the canyon direction. "Use in the air," he said. "Case is with her." "Good." He sat down on the case beside her without being invited, which she did not mind. "Hendren's at the east perimeter," he said. "I know. I just talked to him." "How did that go?" She thought about it. "He knows it's over. He hasn't decided how to conduct himself in that knowledge yet." "Some people get loud," Grund said. "He won't," she said. He's not a loud person. He'll try to minimize and negotiate and find a technical argument. He'll be very professional about losing everything. Grund was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said. She didn't answer. The disciplinary finding. 3 years of your record. Yes. That's a long time to carry something that wasn't. I carried it fine, she said. It came out more sharply than she intended. She adjusted. I carried it. That's not the same as fine, but it's what happened. Grund accepted that without pushing. The desert was cold now, the way it always was at this hour, when the heat of the day had fully withdrawn and the sky was just stars and wind. Somewhere north of the base, a vehicle was moving on the access road, Austin's probably, or the counterintelligence team with the secondary comms equipment. Things were converging, the way things converged when the worst part of a situation had passed, and the work of resolution was beginning. Her radio crackled. Osteen's voice, directed not at the channel but at someone else. She had left Channel 7 open, and the transmission was ambient, half heard. Then Osteen's voice said clearly, "Bring him in." Lena looked up. At the east perimeter, 2 soldiers from the 2nd platoon had walked to Hendren's position. She watched him look at them. She watched him turn to look south, toward the canyon, as though the canyon were a thing he was considering. Then he turned back and spoke briefly to one of the soldiers. She could not hear it, and the soldier responded with the specific brevity of a response that does not leave room for negotiation. Hendren put his hands in front of him. Not behind, not yet. That would come later, in the formal spaces where these things were done correctly. But the gesture was already there in the forward reach of his hands, the acknowledgement that the holding was beginning. One of the aides said something. Hendren turned to him and said something back that was short and final and apparently sufficient, because the aide went silent and did not speak again. Lena watched until Hendren was being walked to the north perimeter, and then she looked away, not out of discomfort, but because she had no particular need to watch it continue. She had seen what she needed to see, which was the moment when the performance stopped and the accountability started. That was enough. She was looking at the desert, the flat, pale expanse of it beyond the base's perimeter lights, when Mallory found her. He came and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, which was unusual for him. When he did speak, his voice had the careful, stripped quality of someone who had recently run out of the defenses they habitually used. "The conduct report," he said. "Yes, I'm going to withdraw it." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know." He held her gaze with the directness that had always been there underneath the other things, the parts of him that were decent and would have worked better if they hadn't been buried under the defensiveness. "But it was wrong. What I filed was, it was me being angry that you saw something I missed. That's not a conduct issue. That's me." He paused. "I'm withdrawing it." She nodded. "Thank you." It was not effusive, and he did not seem to expect it to be. He nodded back and turned to walk away. "Mallory," she said. He stopped. "Witten and Reese," she said. "They both performed well tonight, in ways that went beyond what they were trained for." She looked at the perimeter where both soldiers were visible, moving equipment, talking to each other. "That's worth noting." Mallory looked at them. Something in his face shifted into a simpler arrangement. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He walked away. The desert did not answer. The night did not resolve. Osteen arrived at the perimeter 23 minutes later, and she came with 3 counterintelligence officers and a JAG colonel named Farber, whose presence meant the evidentiary process was already formally underway. Lena watched Osteen stop at the east perimeter where Hendren was being held and speak to him directly for approximately 90 seconds. She watched Hendren's face through the exchange, measured, controlled, making small, precise arguments that she was too far away to hear and that Osteen's expression indicated were not succeeding. Then Osteen turned away and walked toward Lena. She stopped 2 meters out and looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who had arrived at the end of a long calculation. "We have everything," Osteen said. "The server, the physical documents, the secondary comms from his office, and the 2 men from the terminus who are already talking to JAG." She paused. "One of them was in the canyon 3 years ago. He's prepared to make a statement about what Hendren ordered." Lena felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, because relief implied uncertainty that was now resolving, and she had not been uncertain. Something more like weight, redistributing, the kind of physical sensation that happened when you had been carrying something for so long that you had stopped noticing the load, and then someone lifted part of it, and the absence was as startling as the weight had been. "Your disciplinary finding," Osteen said. "I want to formally initiate the review process tonight. I don't want this to wait." "It's been 3 years," Lena said. "It can wait until morning." "It could," Osteen said. "But it shouldn't have had to wait 3 years in the first place." She held Lena's gaze. "I'm initiating the review, tonight." Lena looked at her. She thought about the notebook in her breast pocket, the 4 words she had written 3 nights ago in the darkness of the supply bay. She thought about the 11 soldiers from the operation 3 years ago, and the man who had been alive because she had not stopped when she was told to stop, and the file that said she had been wrong for it. She thought about all of it, and she held Osteen's gaze, and she said, "Okay." Osteen nodded. She pulled out her tablet and began making the call that would initiate the formal review, and behind her at the east perimeter, a soldier walked Hendren to the waiting vehicle, and the vehicle's door closed, and Lena stood in the cold desert air and watched it leave. Somewhere to the south, a second vehicle was approaching the perimeter from the access road. It had its headlights on and was moving at speed, which was unusual for the access road at this hour, and Lena turned to look at it with the automatic attention she brought to things that didn't fit the pattern. Osteen's JAG Colonel Farber was walking to meet it. Lena watched him stop when the vehicle reached the perimeter, watched him speak to the driver, watched his face change. He turned and looked back at the perimeter. He looked at Osteen. He looked at Lena. He walked back quickly. "Colonel Osteen," he said, "the team at Regional Command." He stopped, collected himself. Hendren had a second aide, not one of the 2 who came with him tonight, someone who stayed behind. Osteen looked at him sharply. "And?" He accessed Hendren's office after the primary team cleared the space. Farber looked at his tablet. He removed a physical drive, secondary backup, Hendren's personal copy of the server contents, kept separate from the network drive your team recovered. Lena went still. "The aide's name," Osteen said. "Staff Sergeant Roland Kipp. He's been with Hendren's staff for 14 months. Farber looked up from the tablet. "He left Regional Command 40 minutes ago. He's not responding to communications." Osteen's expression did not change. She looked at Lena, and Lena understood in that moment that the man in the vehicle pulling away from the perimeter was not the only problem, and that the server and the documents and the testimony from the canyon were the foundation of a case that was solid and real. But the copy that Kipp had taken was a full duplicate of 18 months of intelligence, and in the wrong hands, it was not just evidence, it was leverage. And whoever Kipp was taking it to had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Osteen was already on the satellite phone before Farber finished his sentence. Lena did not wait for the call to connect. She turned and walked to the vehicle that had brought the news. The driver was still in the seat, engine running, the way drivers stayed when they expected to move again quickly. And she opened the passenger door and looked at the map on the console screen. "Kipp left Regional Command 40 minutes ago," she said to the driver. "What's the road network between here and the nearest civilian transit point?" The driver, young, specialist rank, still processing the speed at which events had been moving, pulled up the overlay. "South Highway goes to Halverson Junction, about 32 miles. There's a private airfield 6 miles east of the junction, Morrow Field." Lena looked at the map. Halverson Junction sat at the intersection of 2 state routes, which meant multiple exit vectors once Kipp reached it. Morrow Field meant an aircraft could be pre-positioned, which meant the recipient of the drive was not improvising. They had prepared for the possibility that Hendren's office would be searched and had a contingency for extraction already running. This had been planned before tonight. The cache in the canyon, the fire elements, the shot at you, all of it had been built with a fallback. Hendren was supposed to be the one standing at the end of it, but if he wasn't, someone else would collect the backup. She pressed Channel 7. "Osteen, Morrow Field, east of Halverson Junction, private aircraft. Kipp is going to a pre-positioned extraction." Osteen, still on the satellite phone, acknowledged with a single word. Lena heard her relay it to whoever was on the other end of the call. She looked at the map for another 3 seconds, calculating distance and time. 40 minutes ago, Kipp had been at Regional Command. 32 miles at highway speed was 40 minutes, which meant he was there, or close to it, right now. "Drive," she told the specialist. He looked at her. "I don't have authorization to—" "Osteen," she said into Channel 7. Authorize this vehicle for forward movement toward Morrow Field. A beat of silence. Then Osteen's voice. Authorized. Specialist Doan, you drive where Nurse Voss directs. Doan looked at her for one more second, then put the vehicle in gear. Reese appeared at the passenger door before it closed. He looked at her and looked at the moving vehicle and made the calculation in approximately half a second, then got in the back. Neither of them said anything for the first mile. The South Highway was empty at this hour. No traffic, no lights, except the stars and the vehicle's headlights cutting a straight line through the desert dark. Doan drove with focused efficiency, keeping the speed at the edge of what the road allowed. Lena sat with the Channel 7 radio and the terrain map and did not look out the window because the desert at night from a moving vehicle was not useful information. At mile 14, Osteen's voice came through. We have visual confirmation of a light aircraft on the ground at Morrow Field. It was not there at 1800 this evening. Air assets are being repositioned, but they're coming from the opposite side of the basin. ETA is 22 minutes. 22 minutes. Kip had been moving for 45 minutes. He could already be there. If the aircraft lifts before your assets arrive, Lena said. Then we track and intercept at the destination, Osteen said. But the drive, if whoever receives it has time to process and distribute the contents, I know. The intelligence in that backup is not just evidence against Hendren. It includes the identities of sources and methods from operations that are still active. If it reaches the wrong people, I understand what's on it, Lena said. Keep your assets moving. She looked at the map. Morrow Field was 16 miles ahead. Doan had the vehicle at 85 miles per hour on a straight empty road. 11 minutes. They came off the highway onto the Morrow Field access road at 0318, and Lena had Doan cut the headlights at the 1 mile mark. The field itself was visible from the road. A single runway, a small operations building, 2 hangars, and on the apron near the eastern hangar, the navigation lights of an aircraft that was running its engines. Running, not warming up. Running at the power setting for taxi, which meant it was very close to moving. Stop here, she said. Doan stopped. She got out. Reese got out behind her. The desert air was cold and still, and the sound of the aircraft engines carried clearly across the flat ground. She looked at the field layout. The operations building was dark, no staff, which made sense for a private field at this hour. The aircraft was a twin-engine turboprop, positioned nose out on the apron, and near the aircraft's door 2 figures were visible. One was moving toward the aircraft. One was standing still, watching the access road. The one watching the road was not Kip. He was larger, and he was holding something at his side that was not a document case. Lena pressed Channel 7. Osteen, 2 individuals at the aircraft. One is armed. Kip may already be on board. She looked at the aircraft's engines. It's going to move in less than 3 minutes. Assets are 14 minutes out. She looked at Reese. He was looking at the field with the expression of someone who was running the same math she was and arriving at the same answer. The runway runs east-west, she said. If it takes off east, your assets can intercept over the basin. If it goes west, it's into the hill corridor and tracking becomes complicated. So we need to slow it down. Yes. Reese looked at the field. He looked at her. How? She thought about the operations building. She thought about the runway. She thought about what every small airfield had in common, which was a power source for the runway lighting and a radio frequency for the Unicom and a windsock and a fuel depot. And she looked at the eastern hangar, which sat between the apron and the runway threshold. The hangar doors, she said, if they're open and positioned correctly, they extend into the runway clear zone. A pilot who doesn't know the field won't take off with an obstruction on the runway margin. He'll check, which costs time. Can we open them from outside? Most small hangars have manual release on the exterior for emergency access. She looked at the distance between their position and the eastern hangar. 400 meters of open ground with the armed figure on the apron watching the access road. I need you to draw his attention to the road. Reese looked at her. How? Get back in the vehicle, turn the headlights on, drive toward the field entrance at normal speed. And while he's watching me. I go around the southern fence line to the hangar. Reese was quiet for 3 seconds. If he decides to shoot at the vehicle instead of watch it, then you stop the vehicle and get low and call Osteen. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to engage him. I'm asking you to be a distraction. Reese looked at the field one more time. He has a gun, he said. You have the same rifle I've had all night. That's not the same as Reese, she said it quietly. I know what I'm doing. He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him making the decision that he had been making incrementally all evening, the ongoing revision of what he thought he understood about her, and the ongoing choice to follow that revision rather than fight it. Okay, he said. He got back in the vehicle. Lena moved south. The southern fence line was chain link, 8 feet, with a strand of barbed wire at the top. She went over it the way she had been taught to go over chain link fences, efficiently, without drama, accepting the minor cost to her hands that the wire required, and dropped to the ground on the inside of the perimeter. Behind her, she heard the vehicle's headlights come on and the engine note change as Doan accelerated toward the field entrance. She moved along the inside of the southern fence, staying below the sight line of the apron, covering the 200 meters to the eastern hangar in 90 seconds. The aircraft engines were louder here, the turboprop note cycling through power checks, the particular sound of a pilot running his pre-takeoff procedure. She reached the hangar's south face. Manual release panel. She found it where it usually was, 6 feet up on the exterior wall, a red-handled lever behind a wire cage. She broke the cage seal with the butt of the rifle, pulled the lever, and heard the electric motor disengage. The hangar doors, released from their locked position, were now on manual rollers. She pushed. The doors were heavy. She put her shoulder into it and moved the first panel outward, grinding along its track, the sound swallowed by the aircraft engine noise. The first panel moved 2 meters, which was enough to extend a section of door into the runway clear zone. She moved to the second panel and pushed again. Her knee announced its objection loudly. She pushed through it. On the apron, the armed figure had turned toward the vehicle at the field entrance. She could see him from around the hangar corner, watching Doan's headlights. His posture changed from surveillance to the forward attention of someone assessing a potential threat. The second door moved. Lena stepped back from the hangar and looked at the runway. The extended door panels were visible from the apron, not dramatically, but visible enough that any pilot conducting a runway scan before takeoff would see an obstruction on the threshold. The aircraft's engine note changed, then changed back. Then a voice from the aircraft's direction, the pilot, she thought, on the intercom or speaking to someone on the apron, loud enough to carry over the engine. Something on the runway. The armed figure turned from the road. He walked toward the runway threshold, which meant he was moving away from the aircraft door and away from whoever was still on the apron or inside the aircraft. Lena moved. She came around the northern edge of the hangar and crossed the apron at speed, keeping the aircraft's fuselage between herself and the armed figure's position. The aircraft door was open, a short set of steps extended. One figure remained on the apron, smaller than the armed man, carrying a document case, standing at the base of the steps with the posture of someone who had been about to board and had stopped. Kip. Staff Sergeant Roland Kip was 28, slight, with a face that looked younger than his rank, and a document case held against his chest with both arms in the way that people held things they had decided were worth running for. He turned when he heard her footsteps. She stopped 4 meters away. Put it down, she said. Kip looked at her. He looked at the case. He looked toward the runway where the armed figure was examining the hangar doors, and back at her. And something moved through his expression that was complicated. Not simply fear because he had decided to do this and had known what that decision cost, but the specific reckoning that happened when the execution of a decision arrived at its consequences. It won't matter, he said. His voice was younger than she expected. Even if you take it, they already have copies of the core material. This was just leverage, she said. I know. Then you know this doesn't end it. Maybe not, she said, but it ends tonight. Kip looked at the case. He looked at her rifle. He was calculating, she could see it, the distance, the angle, whether the armed figure would notice in time, whether the aircraft was still an option. It was not an option. The pilot's voice had gone quiet, which meant the pilot had seen the hangar doors and was not taking off until the obstruction was resolved, which meant the window that Kip had been given was closing. The person you're running to, Lena said. They sent you. They gave you the contingency plan. They have everything set up. She held his gaze. And if you don't make it out with that drive, do you think they're going to wait for you? Something shifted in his face. You're 28, she said. You've been in Hendren's staff for 14 months. Before that, you had a clean record. She took one step forward. You still have a choice. I already made my choice. You made a choice, she said. That's not the same thing as being out of them. The armed figure at the runway was walking back toward the apron. 30 seconds, maybe less. Kip looked at him. He looked at Lena. He looked at the case in his hands. He set it on the ground. Lena was beside it in 3 steps. She pressed channel 7. Osteen, Kip is in custody. Drive is secured. Armed individual on the apron coming in from the runway direction. Assets are 9 minutes, Osteen said. 9 minutes. She picked up the case and looked at the armed figure, who had stopped when he saw her, who was running his own calculation now. A different one, with different variables, because Kip was not on the aircraft, and the document case was not in his hand. Don't, she said to him. She said it with the specific quality of a word that was both instruction and assessment, a word that communicated she had done this before, and that doing it again was not something that required significant effort. The armed figure looked at her for 4 seconds. He put the weapon on the ground. Osteen's assets arrived in 8 minutes and 40 seconds, which was faster than 9 and slower than 8, and was, under the circumstances, exactly enough. 2 vehicles and a helicopter, the helicopter landing on the runway after the obstruction was manually cleared, and the controlled activity of a situation being formally resolved. Kip was processed at the aircraft. The armed figure, who turned out to be a former military contractor with a service record that would take the JAG team 2 days to fully unpack, was processed beside him. The document drive was transferred into an evidence chain that Farber's team established on site, each step documented, each signature witnessed. Lena stood with the rifle slung and her knee complaining and the graze on her arm stiffening in the cold, and she watched the process happen with the detached attention of someone who had contributed what they were going to contribute and was now waiting for the machinery to finish what it had started. Reese found her at the field's perimeter fence. He had a cut on his chin from where his head had hit the steering wheel during a hard stop. The armed figure had fired 1 shot at the vehicle, which had gone through the front windshield without hitting anyone, and Doan had braked hard enough that Reese's face had made contact with the seat back. You're bleeding, she said. I know. He touched the cut. The windshield? Sit down. Let me look at it. He sat on the fender of the vehicle, and she looked at the cut in the glow of the field's perimeter light. Shallow, not arterial, the kind that looked alarming because faces bled with enthusiasm and was in practice manageable. She cleaned it with the last of the field kit's antiseptic and applied a steri-strip. That's going to be ugly for a week, she said. Great, he said. You did well tonight. He was quiet for a moment. I drove a car toward a man with a gun, he said. That's exactly what was needed, she said. Which is the point. She closed the kit. Knowing what's needed and doing it anyway. That's the whole job. Reese looked at the field, at the activity around the aircraft, at the helicopter sitting on the runway with its rotors still turning. What happens now, he said. To you, I mean. She thought about it. Review process. Probably a few weeks of formal proceedings. A lot of paperwork. And after? She looked at the desert. The east was just beginning to differentiate from the sky. Not light yet, but the earliest suggestion of the difference between dark and darker that preceded light. She had always been awake for this part of the night more often than she would have chosen. I don't know yet, she said. And she meant it, which was different from before, when not knowing had felt like a door closed. Now it felt like one that was opening, which was uncomfortable in its own way, but uncomfortable in the direction of something rather than away from it. The formal review took 11 days. It was not a clean 11 days. It was phone calls and depositions and a review board that convened at regional command. Not Hendren's regional command, which was now under its own investigation, but at the next level up, in a building with better lighting and a more competent administrative staff. Lena answered questions for 4 hours on the first day and 2 hours on the second and was excused on the third when the board indicated they had sufficient direct testimony and needed time to review the documentary evidence. She used the time to visit Yu, who was in a surgical recovery ward at the nearest military medical center, and who was, by the 4th day, complaining about the food with sufficient energy that the nursing staff considered it a positive clinical indicator. The board subpoenaed the server contents, Yu told her from the bed. Her right arm in a sling and a cup of the food service coffee that was somehow worse than Fort Calder's held in her left. All of it. Hendren's attorneys tried to challenge the chain of custody on the physical documents, but Farber's team documented the recovery well enough that the challenge failed. Kip, Lena said, cooperating, fully. You looked at the coffee. He was in for 14 months, and he was already starting to understand what he'd gotten himself into. I think he was looking for a way out, and you gave him one. He gave himself one. Maybe. You looked at her. The person Kip was running to. The aircraft's registered owner traces to a shell company that traces to a financial structure that the counterintelligence team has been looking at for 2 years in a completely separate context. She paused. Hendren wasn't the top of this. I know. That investigation is going to take considerably longer than yours. I know that too. Lena looked at Yu's sling. How's the shoulder? It works, Yu said. It'll work better in 6 weeks. I'm told I'm lucky it didn't clip the subclavian. She said it the way people said things like that, with the flat acceptance of someone who had processed the near miss and filed it and moved on, because there was no useful alternative. You knew what I was, she said. When I found you at the motor pool, you recognized me. I recognized the work, Lena said. Not you specifically. Same agency? Adjacent. You looked at her for a moment. What did they do with you after the disciplinary finding? They couldn't have just put you in a nursing program. They could. They did. Lena looked at the window. There are people who believe that someone who has done a specific kind of work and then becomes inconvenient should be given something quiet and supervised and far from anything sensitive, and that over time they'll either accept it or they'll make a mistake that justifies ending their career entirely. She paused. They were wrong about that. Evidently, Yu said. The nursing is real, Lena said. I did the program. I have the certification. I learned things I didn't know before. She thought about Holloway, who was recovering in this same facility 3 floors up, and Kessler from the first incident, and Reese's knee and Witten's arm. I'm good at it. You're good at a lot of things, Yu said. Yes, Lena said. I am. Oh. The review board issued its findings on the 11th day. Lena received the document in a room at Regional Command with Osteen across the table and Farber to her left, and a board member whose name she had already forgotten to her right. The document was 14 pages. She read all of it. The disciplinary finding filed by Colonel Marcus Hendren 3 years prior was vacated in its entirety. The finding had been determined to be retaliatory in nature, filed in response to actions that had prevented an extrajudicial execution, and had been supported by a falsified record of events that Hendren had subsequently classified to prevent review. Lena's combat qualifications were fully restored. Her service record would reflect the correction. A formal citation was issued for the original action, the one that had saved the 11 soldiers, and a second citation for the actions at Fort Calder and Morrow Field. The second citation listed her as Specialist Agent Voss, not Nurse Voss. She read that line twice. The intelligence community review is separate from this, Osteen said, but my understanding is that it will reach a compatible conclusion. What happens to Hendren? Lena said. Farber answered. Court-martial. The charges include espionage, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. The evidentiary record is extensive. He paused. He will not be returning to any position. Lena looked at the document. The people he sold information to, the network. The counterintelligence investigation is ongoing. The cooperation from Kip has accelerated it significantly. Several arrests have already been made at the organizational level. Farber folded his hands. It won't be complete for a long time, but it's moving. And the source, Lena said. The man Hendren ordered executed 3 years ago. Osteen looked at her. He was located 18 months ago by a separate team. He's alive. Lena held very still for a moment. He had been relocated, Osteen said carefully. He's in a position where he's safe. The team that found him, they didn't have access to the classified portions of your file. They didn't know the connection. She paused. He knows what happened. He was told. Lena looked at the table. She looked at the 14-page document with her name at the top, and 3 years of her life redistributed into their correct shape. Thank you, she said. It was to Osteen, but it was also to no one in particular, which was occasionally the only honest way to say a thing. Osteen made the offer the following week. She called it an opportunity rather than an offer, which was the careful language of someone who knew the person across from them well enough to understand that certain words landed differently than others. The opportunity was a position in a joint intelligence and field operations unit, new, deliberately structured to avoid the command vulnerabilities that had allowed Hendren's situation to develop, with oversight architecture that Lena could look at and identify the gaps in if she chose to. She was given a week to decide. She spent 3 days of it at Fort Calder, which was not where she expected to spend them, but which was where she ended up. Grund was still there, managing the administrative aftermath of the exercise and the incident with the particular patients he brought to all things. She found him in the motor pool on the second morning, running a vehicle inspection with Witten, and he looked up when she arrived with the expression of someone who had expected her and was glad she was there. "The position," he said. He did not ask what it was. "You're thinking about it." "I'm thinking about whether I want to go back to being what I was," she said. "Which was?" "Useful for specific purposes, effective, frequently right." She looked at the vehicles. "Alone." Grund considered this. "You weren't alone in that canyon," he said. "No, I wasn't." She thought about Reese on the access road in a vehicle with no windshield. She thought about Witten's direct gaze in the transport vehicle on the first day. She thought about Mallory at the perimeter, buying 11 minutes with bureaucratic process because she had asked him to. That was different. How? She thought about how to say it accurately. "Usually I'm useful to a mission. In the canyon, I was useful to people." She paused. "It's a different feeling." Grund looked at her. "The new position, would it require you to stop being useful to people?" "No." "Then I don't understand the problem." "The problem is that for 3 years I've been useful to people in a context where nobody expected anything more from me. And now there are options, and the options are—" She stopped. "Bigger," Grund said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Lena," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. "You've been operating at a fraction of what you're capable of for 3 years, and you still managed to prevent a very large problem from becoming catastrophic. What do you think you're capable of when you're not limited?" She looked at him. "The nursing was real," he said. "Keep it. The other thing is also real. Keep that too." He shrugged, which was not a dismissal, but a simplification. "You don't have to choose between who you were and what you did these past 3 years. Both of them got us out of that canyon." She stood with that for a moment. "You should be giving speeches," she said. "Absolutely not," Grund said, and went back to the vehicle inspection. She visited Holloway before she left. He was in the recovery ward at the same facility as you, 3 floors up, and he was sitting up in bed with the careful posture of someone who had been told not to move quickly and was complying with that instruction while visibly disagreeing with it. He was 23 and had the face of someone who was still deciding what kind of person he was going to be. She sat in the chair beside the bed without being invited, which he did not seem to mind. "How's the wound?" she said. "Healing. They said 6 weeks. Closer to 8 for that depth, but you'll be full function." He looked at her. "They told me what you did. In the canyon. After I was—" He gestured at his side. "You held the pack the whole time," she said. "That's why the outcome was what it was. You told me to." "Lots of people get told to do things," she said. "You did it." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Were you scared? In the canyon, when it went bad? Were you scared?" She thought about it. She owed him an honest answer, which meant she could not give him the useful one, the one that would make him feel better about what had happened, and had to give him the true one instead. "Not in the way you mean," she said. "There wasn't time for it to be fear in the normal sense. It was more awareness. Every wrong decision and what it cost. Every second where something could go worse." She looked at her hands. "Fear is what you feel after, when you have time to understand how close things were." "And after?" "After, yes." She looked at him. "It doesn't mean you did it wrong. It means you were paying attention." Holloway considered this for a long time. "I want to come back to the unit," he said finally. "After this. I want to go back." "Good," she said. "Even knowing what happened?" "Especially knowing what happened," she said. "You know more now than you did before. That's not a reason to stop. That's the whole point of surviving something." He looked at her steadily, with the particular attention of someone who was storing what they heard because they planned to use it. She stood. 8 weeks, she said. Maybe 7 if you do the physical therapy without cutting corners. I'm not going to cut corners, he said. I know, she said. That's why I told you 7. She called Osteen on the 8th day and accepted the position. There were conditions, which she laid out with the directness that she had always had, and that the disciplinary finding had not diminished. She would maintain her medical certifications and use them. She would not be assigned to operations where the command structure replicated the conditions that had produced Hendren. She would have direct access to oversight channels independent of her immediate command. Osteen agreed to all of it without negotiation, which either meant the conditions were reasonable or meant Osteen had expected them and had already made the arrangements. Probably both. She did not ask for her old call sign back. It had not been hers in the way people thought it had been. It had been a designation, a label attached to a set of capabilities, useful to the people who needed those capabilities and meaningless to the people who didn't. Iron Wraith had been a tool. Lena Voss was a person. The distinction mattered more to her now than it had when she was 29 and had not yet learned the difference by losing it. The ceremony at Fort Calder was Osteen's idea, which Lena disagreed with for 3 days before conceding that some things were not about her preferences and were instead about the record. What was visible, what was stated aloud in front of witnesses, what got written into the permanent shape of events. It was not a large ceremony. The platoon was there, or most of them. Holloway attended in a wheelchair and was annoyed about the wheelchair and sat in the front row anyway. Witten and Reese were in the second row, both of them in dress uniform, both of them with the slightly formal expression of soldiers who had cleaned up to mark an occasion and were not entirely comfortable with the cleaning up. Grund stood to the right of the formation. He looked exactly the same as he always looked, which was to say, patient and present, and not particularly impressed by ceremonial occasions, which Lena appreciated more than any expression she could have seen on his face. Mallory was there. He had not been required to attend. The ceremony was not about him. He was not receiving anything, not being recognized, not formally included in the proceedings. He stood at the back of the assembled group in his dress uniform and did not speak to anyone before the ceremony began. Osteen presented the citations. She read the language of the formal restoration aloud, the vacating of the disciplinary finding, the restoration of qualifications, the citation for the original action and for Fort Calder. The language was precise and official and said in clear sentences the things that had been true for 3 years and had been kept from being said. Lena stood and listened and felt each sentence land in the particular way that truth lands when it has been waiting a long time to be spoken in public. When Osteen pinned the commendation to her uniform, she said quietly, for Lena only, "This should have happened 3 years ago. I'm sorry it didn't." "You weren't in a position to do it 3 years ago," Lena said. "No, but someone should have been." "Yes," Lena said, "someone should have." It was not forgiveness and it was not closure, because forgiveness and closure were things that happened over time and in private and could not be pinned to a uniform at a ceremony. It was acknowledgement. It was the record corrected. It was enough to work from. Mallory approached her after, when the formation had broken and the group had dispersed into the smaller conversations that followed official occasions. He was carrying his cover in his hands, which was a gesture that read differently than it would have 3 weeks ago. "I watched the review board findings," he said, "the summary they released. What Hendren did." He looked at her. "You spent 3 years." "Yes," she said. "And you didn't—" He stopped. "You could have pushed. You could have made a formal case, worked the channels, found someone who would listen." "I tried," she said. "Early on. The record was classified. The witnesses were reassigned or not speaking. The command structure above me was Hendren's structure." She looked across the yard at the desert visible beyond the base perimeter. "Eventually you accept what you can't change, and you decide what to do with what you have." "And what did you do?" "I became a nurse," she said. "A good one." Mallory was quiet for a moment. "The conduct report," he said. "Withdrawing it didn't— I know it didn't fix what I did. The way I treated you from the first day." "No," she said. "It didn't." He absorbed that. He did not flinch, which was the version of him she respected, the one that was capable of holding an uncomfortable truth without deflecting it. You saved my people, he said, every one of them. In conditions I couldn't manage, seeing things I missed, making decisions I wouldn't have made. He met her eyes. I dismissed you because you were quiet, and you didn't have a combat record I could read, and you didn't perform authority the way I expected authority to look. He paused. I was wrong. You were, she said, and you learned. She looked at him steadily. That's not nothing. He nodded once, which was not absolution and was not meant to be. It was two people acknowledging, in the specific shorthand of people who had been through something difficult together, that the accounting was at least honest. He put on his cover and walked back toward the operations building. Reese found her at the perimeter fence after, which was where she had gone when the conversations became too numerous and too repetitive, and she needed a few minutes of the particular silence that existed at the edge of a military base where the designated space ended and the desert began. He stood beside her without preamble, which she had come to expect. You're taking the new position, he said. Yes. And leaving the unit. I was never formally part of the unit, she said. That's not what I mean. She looked at him. He was 26 and had a steri strip on his chin from the windshield and had spent a night in the Halverson Desert doing things that were not in his job description and had done all of them without complaint and with increasing competence. I know what you mean, she said. Yes. I'm leaving. Reese looked at the desert. What you said to Holloway, about fear being what you feel after. Yes. I've been feeling it, he said, since that night, replaying things, wondering about the parts where it could have gone differently. That's correct, she said. That's the right response. It doesn't feel right. It rarely does. She had looked at the desert alongside him. But the soldiers who stopped doing it, who stopped running the tape and asking the questions, those are the ones who make the same mistakes twice. She paused. The fear is data. What you do with it is the choice. Reese was quiet for a long moment. The desert light was the afternoon light now, the flat golden quality of it that made the basin look larger than it was, the shadows long and the air very still. I'm going to apply for special operations training, he said, the selection program. She looked at him. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, he said. I never thought I was... He stopped. That night, I kept expecting to freeze or to make a wrong call or to be the thing that caused a problem. And I didn't. He said it not with pride, but with the careful attention of someone examining evidence. I want to know if that was the night or if it's me. There's only one way to find out, she said. I know. He looked at her. You were going to tell me to apply anyway. I was. Even before I said it. From around the second day, she said. But it needed to come from you first. He almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh. It was the expression that preceded one. The acknowledgement that something was both true and slightly ridiculous. Good luck, she said, with the selection. Good luck with the new position, he said. They stood at the perimeter fence for another minute in the comfortable silence of people who had established, through an unusual sequence of events, a mutual understanding that did not require maintenance conversation to sustain it. Then she turned and walked back toward the base interior, past the operations building, past the supply bay where she had slept 3 weeks ago, and where she had heard footsteps on gravel and made a decision to get up instead of stay down, which was, when she thought about it, not a decision unique to that night, but a decision she had been making repeatedly, in various forms, for as long as she could remember. Get up. Look at what's there. Move toward it, not away from it. It was not a complicated philosophy. It did not always produce comfortable outcomes, but it had produced this one, this specific evening, in this specific desert, with her name restored and her record corrected, and the people she had carried quietly for 3 weeks now knowing, at minimum, that she had been worth paying attention to. That was not everything, but it was real, which was the standard she had learned, over years and at significant cost, to hold higher than impressive. She passed the communications building, where 2 of U's counterintelligence officers were still working through the secondary comms documentation. She passed the vehicle depot, where Doan was back to his regular duties with a new windshield and a story he would be telling for a long time. She passed the perimeter gate, where the duty officer, not Ferris now, someone she didn't know, nodded as she went by. She walked to her vehicle, which was still in the visitor lot because she had still, technically, been a visitor to this base. She put her kit bag in the passenger seat. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at Fort Calder. The prefabricated buildings, the gravel roads, the supply depot, and the motor pool and the medical tent where the whole thing had started. She thought about Hendren, who was waiting for a court-martial with the measured calm of a man who had already hired the best attorneys available and who would spend the next several years in the machinery of military justice, which wasn't swift, but was, in her experience, thorough. She thought about the 11 soldiers from 3 years ago who had gone home from a canyon that they had not known was about to kill them. She thought about the man who had been alive because she had not stopped. She thought about all of it, and then she set it down, not forgot it, because she would never forget it, but set it down in the way that you set down something you have been carrying and that is now in the place it belongs, in the record, in the formal language, in the citation pinned to her uniform. She started the vehicle. The radio on the center console, Channel 7, still open from the days of the operation, crackled once with the ambient static of an empty frequency. Then Yu's voice, from the medical facility where she was recovering and apparently running operations from her hospital bed, which surprised no one. Iron Wraith, your channel is clear. Lena looked at the radio for a moment. She picked it up. She held it for 3 seconds, feeling the weight of it, the familiar weight of a call sign, and everything it had meant, and everything it had cost, and everything that had come after. Then she set it down without responding and switched off the channel and drove through the gate, and the desert opened in front of her, flat and vast and indifferent in the way it had always been, and she drove into it without looking back. Not because the past was finished with her. It wasn't. It never fully was. But because she had stopped letting it be the thing that decided where she was going. She had been dismissed and diminished and erased, and she had carried it quietly, and she had done the work anyway, and the work had been real, and the people she had reached with it were alive, and the truth that had been buried under 3 years of classified paperwork was now in the permanent record, in the sentences that would be read and reread and could not be reclassified. No one had handed any of it back to her. She had not waited to be recognized. She had gone into the canyon when Mallory told her to stay behind, and to the terminus when Yu told her to hold position, and to the airfield when no one told her anything at all. She had made the calls that needed to be made, treated the wounds that needed to be treated, and stood in the places where standing was required. The rest of it, the commendation, the restored record, Mallory's acknowledgement, Reese at the perimeter fence, the rest of it was just the shape that reality took when it finally caught up to what was true. She had never needed them to believe she was exceptional. She had needed them to be worth saving. And they were. Imperfect, complicated, some of them wrong about her in ways that cost everyone time, but worth it. That had always been the answer, from the first moment she arrived at Fort Calder and looked at the terrain map and saw the ridge that no one else was watching. Some people needed to be told they mattered before they acted. Lena Voss had simply acted and trusted that the mattering would take care of itself. It had. She drove south through the Halverson Basin as the sun moved west, and the desert was exactly as vast and indifferent as it had always been, and she was exactly herself, which was the only thing she had ever needed to be.